Hello everyone, I'm the storyteller, and today I'll take you on a spooky story. But don't worry, it will be a gentle and relaxing journey before you drift off to sleep. If you're looking for a tale that's just mysterious enough and gentle enough to relax to, then you've come to the right place. Now, find yourself a comfortable space, close your eyes, and let the story begin. Story 1. Night Walking. The cold, deserted road stretched on endlessly, the weak streetlights illuminating the man's every step. It was late at night. The space was strangely quiet. A light breeze blew through, making the trees on the side of the road rustle like the whispers of old souls. The middle-aged man, who was drunk after a drinking session, was not very aware of the world around him. He staggered step by step, his mouth tightly holding a cigarette, the other hand holding a slightly empty glass of wine, not knowing if it was wine or sadness. This path, he knew, was a shortcut that few people took. Only a few brave or drunk people dared to enter at night like this. Its coldness, its eerie silence, seemed to warn of something vague, elusive. Suddenly, a dim light flashed ahead. He didn't pay much attention, just continued walking. But after a while, he heard a strange noise. It wasn't the sound of insects or wild animals, but a strange sound, like the sound of the earth being turned over. The man walked quickly towards it, his eyes slightly blurred, trying to see clearly. And then, before his eyes was an unforgettable scene. The girl, about 9 or 10 years old, was sitting in the middle of the path, her eyes staring at a small hole she was digging. Her tattered clothes, her pale skin made him shiver. The air around them suddenly became cold, as if winter had arrived, although the weather was still hot. The man, in a daze as if he didn't understand anything, approached the girl. "What are you doing here in the middle of the night?" His voice was hoarse from drunkenness. The girl raised her head to look at him. Her eyes were so dark and deep that nothing could be read. Her mouth curved into a strange smile, as if she knew something that he couldn't understand. "I'm digging my father's grave," she said, her voice as soft as the wind. "He caused my mother to miscarry and abandoned us. Now he's dead." The man, at first thinking that the girl was just talking nonsense, thought that perhaps her family was too poor to pay for a funeral, to bury her properly. So he didn't bother to pay any more attention. However, as he turned to leave, something wrong made him stop. It felt like there was some force holding him back, making him unable to continue moving. He tripped over a dry branch, lost his balance, and fell to the ground. At that moment, his head hit a rock hard. The dry sound of the collision echoed in the quiet space, and then everything quietly sank into darkness. Blood flowed from the wound, mixed with the ground, forming a dark puddle, and mud gradually covered his body. From afar, no one would know that this was a corpse, because it looked like a newly dug grave. The little girl stood there, her eyes still glued to the corpse, her mysterious smile never fading. Her voice, whispered in the quiet air, finally done. The man, after falling, no longer had the chance to feel the pain. His death came too quickly, too suddenly, as if some force had decided to end his existence at this very moment. But there was one strange thing. Although he was dead, no one knew. And he was not lying there, alone. The girl was still standing there, her eyes fixed on the corpse, her mysterious smile still unchanged. But when the moonlight swept across her face, one could see something very different in her eyes. It was cold, an emotionless look, not afraid of death. The girl did not rush to leave, nor did she look up at the black sky, but just stood there, silently, as if waiting for something. The night continued to pass in silence. Not a sound, only the chirping of insects echoed in the distance. The man, in the moment of falling into a state of unconsciousness before death, did not know that something was hovering around him, something very close, as if there was a ghost standing behind him, watching his every move. The atmosphere here suddenly became stifling, heavy, as if the air was being sucked out of this space, leaving only suffocation, like a giant tomb engulfing everything. A few minutes later, while the girl was still standing there, a black shadow passed behind her. Her eyes blinked slightly, but she still did not turn to look. The black shadow passed by, then disappeared into the air as if it had never existed. But in the girl's heart, something had changed. A vague fear, a feeling that even she could not explain. The man's corpse soon began to move strangely. A cool breath, like the breath of a spirit, began to seep through the cracks of his body. His dirty fingers began to twitch slightly, as if trying to stand up on their own, but couldn't. At that moment, a small noise rang out, a whisper. The little girl turned back to the corpse. Her black eyes seemed to see through everything. Suddenly, a voice spoke from the darkness. Dead. Really dead. It wasn't the dead man's voice, but someone else's voice. Another voice. A voice she recognized. A voice full of menace and fear. A voice she would never forget. The little girl looked up, the faint light from the moonlight shining on her face, revealing her expressionless face. But a sudden feeling of unease rose within her. She didn't dare to look around, but deep down, she felt something approaching. A pair of footsteps slowly approached, not human, but some creature, unidentifiable. With each step, the earth and rocks underfoot made a dry sound, echoing in the quiet space. Those footsteps were getting closer, and then they stopped. From behind, a dark shadow appeared, unclear, but enough for the girl to feel its presence. It stood there, silent, not moving, but something in the space began to change. The air became colder, and in the space between the clouds, a small streak of light passed by. The dark shadow moved slightly. The girl did not turn around, her eyes still looking at the corpse. But she felt something pulling her closer, like an irresistible hypnosis. The man's death was not the end, but a beginning. The little girl turned her head and looked at the shadow. There was a strange determination in her eyes. Her mysterious smile became clearer, as if there was a secret that only she knew. Tonight, everything would change. The corpse was not the end, but the beginning of a bigger nightmare. A soft whistle sounded from the shadow, followed by a cold wind that cut through the quiet atmosphere. The little girl approached the corpse, her hand outstretched as if she was calling for something. Something that once existed, now hidden in the darkness. The little girl was not afraid. On the contrary, she felt happy. Her smile seemed to challenge everything around her. She knew clearly that death was not the end, but the beginning of something bigger, more ghostly, something that would never be forgotten. As the man's body began to crack, as if it wanted to rise from the ground, a cold voice rang out from the darkness. It's not over yet. That voice, its sound abruptly cut through the silence of the night, like a warning, a curse of the souls that could not be released. The girl looked up at the sky, feeling the change in the air, and she smiled because she knew that her next steps would lead her into a world from which no one could escape. The cold air filled the deserted street, but now, the cold was not the same as before. It was not the usual cold of the night, but something deeper, as if the sky had drained all the warmth from this space. A strange feeling spread with every step the little girl took, as if something was watching her every move. The little girl stood there in the darkness, her eyes never leaving the dead man's body. But that silence did not last long, because as soon as the little girl turned to look at the dark figure in front of her, the space suddenly changed. A sound like the sound of tearing air rang out behind her. That sharp screech pierced the night, startling the little girl. She turned around, eyes wide, but only saw silence all around. But she knew her feeling could not be wrong. Something unusual was happening. The black shadow was no longer standing still like before. It moved step by step, closer to the little girl, but without making any sound. Only a cold wind followed it, like a soul lingering in this space. Its steps were light but undeniably threatening, like a predator approaching its prey. The little girl still stood there, her dark eyes as if she did not feel any fear. She smiled, a cold smile, then suddenly turned around, walking towards the man's corpse. Her feet were clearly imprinted on the ground. With each step, the ground under her feet seemed to have a slight change. The corpse still lay there, silent, showing no signs of life. But the little girl knew his death was not that simple. Suddenly, from the darkness, another sound rang out, but this time it was not the sound of wind or footsteps. It was a groan, a cry of pain, as if someone was suffering terrible pain. The cry echoed from afar, each time it rang out, making the space dense, heavier. The girl did not turn around. Her eyes were still fixed on the corpse. And then, in a moment, when the groan was getting closer, something strange happened. The head of the man's corpse began to move, just a little, but enough to make the girl stop. A thin mist like the breath of a soul slowly invaded his body. And then, he slowly sat up. His head slowly lifted. His neck made a cracking sound, as if a bone was dislocated. But he did not fall, but kept his balance, his eyes wide open. But there was no light in them. His eyes became dark, as if they had been taken over by a darkness. The girl stared at him, the smile still on her lips, unwavering. In the end, she whispered coldly, "Death is just a meaningless end." The man said nothing, just looked at the girl with empty eyes. But then, something strange began to happen. His fingers began to move, each one curling slightly, then touching the ground, as if searching for a support. Gradually, his body began to rise, every joint creaking in pain, but he did not scream. Instead, a soft laugh came from his throat, a strange, distorted sound, as if it were not human anymore. And then, from his mouth, something began to flow out. Not blood, but a thick, black liquid, flowing from the corner of his lips, dripping onto the ground, making a small sound, like stones falling into water. The girl, although not panicking, her eyes began to widen. She felt that everything was changing. Some power was being released. Not from the girl, but from the corpse before her. "We cannot escape fate, Deefisan," the man said, but it was no longer his voice but another voice, high-pitched, strange, as if controlled by an invisible force. Death is just a door, a path. There is no end. The sky above suddenly darkened, as if a thick layer of black clouds had rolled in, blocking the moonlight. The air became stifling, heavy, and then, in that dark space, another sound rang out, a ghostly sound, like the call of souls. The screeches, the moans, blended together to create the haunting, ghostly music. The girl, though used to strange things, could not help but feel a little shiver. But she knew this was not the end. This was just the beginning of something bigger, darker. Strange footsteps echoed through the space again. This time not of humans, but of something dark. A black shadow gradually emerging from the night, moving closer. Everything around seemed to be swallowed by silence. Only a sharp screech remained, echoing in the endless space. The space around her became suffocatingly quiet. The strange sounds, the piercing screams from the dead man's body seemed to echo deep into her mind. Although the faint light from the waning moon shone down, the darkness seemed to have its own life, suddenly rising and swallowing everything. The girl looked at the corpse that had stood up, now slowly moving towards her, each step bringing with it a cold air current that made her skin rise layer upon layer of goosebumps. She was not afraid. Her eyes were still cold, but a strange feeling kept rising in her heart. A feeling she couldn't name, but she knew it was change. Suddenly, she felt as if there was a new link connecting the strange events that happened in this dark night, as if something was pulling her down a path of no return. The corpse was now near the girl. The man's fingers stretched out. They were like dry branches, writhing, searching for something to hold on to. His empty eyes seemed to see through everything, but there was no life in them. Only the cold nothingness of death. The girl did not retreat, her feet still firmly on the ground, as if some invisible force was holding her back. The man opened his mouth slightly, but instead of the familiar sounds of humanity, only eerie whispers came from his throat, like a curse from an unliberated soul. You cannot escape. This is only the beginning. Those words, although invisible, were like a warning, like a shackle tightening on the girl's mind. And then, from behind, darkness seemed to flare up, a flickering green light piercing the thick atmosphere, tearing apart the night. The girl turned around, but saw nothing clearly. There was only darkness and cold gusts of wind. They whipped at her face like claps from another world, but no one was standing there. The atmosphere in the space began to change, as if strange things were waiting to happen. And suddenly, she heard a slight noise from underground, as if there was an object moving underground, causing the ground to shake slightly. Immediately, the man's body froze. He stood still, not moving, but from the darkness behind him, another beam of light flashed, this time stronger and more intense. It suddenly appeared right in front of the girl's eyes, as if to tell her that what she was facing was not something that could be controlled by reason. With an almost unconscious movement, the girl raised her hand and pointed to where the light appeared. The little girl whispered, "This shadow, it doesn't belong to this world. But why do I feel familiar?" The light slowly retreated, not by a gust of wind or any force, but by itself, being sucked back into the darkness, as if there was an invisible force controlling everything. A feeling of terror welled up in the little girl, but there was still something strange that was holding her mind, keeping her from running away. The darkness became even denser. The space was compressed. The light from the moon was still not enough to illuminate everything. In this space, it seemed that death was not an end, but a transition. The little girl stood there, her eyes fixed on the man's corpse, still unable to understand why life could return after being buried in this darkness. Just as the little girl felt the change in the air, suddenly, a laugh rang out, not from the man anymore, but from another source. A laugh that could chill anyone who heard it. The little girl did not turn around, but fear appeared in her heart for the first time, overwhelming all the courage she had. And then, from the darkness, another figure appeared, vague but extremely clear. It was the figure of a woman, but her face was covered by a black cloth. Only her eyes were clear, deep and black, as if wanting to swallow everything in front of her. This woman approached the little girl, and each step she took seemed to make the ground tremble. The little girl felt her presence, but could not move. Her feet were nailed to the ground. When the woman stopped in front of the little girl, the space suddenly became suffocatingly silent. The little girl wanted to open her mouth, but she couldn't. She didn't know what was happening, but she felt a power, a powerful and terrifying spirit rising from within this darkness. Something was approaching, and it wasn't something she could face. The laughter from the dead man rang out again, but this time, the laughter was no longer his. It was the laughter of a soul that couldn't be released, a soul trapped in this world, wanting to drag the little girl into eternal darkness. The little girl, although she didn't understand what was happening, knew in her heart she only had one choice. Story 2. Money Hell. Los Angeles at night has a strange beauty. The warm street lights flicker in the darkness, mixed with the hustle and bustle of late-night life. The downtown street, full of brightly lit shops and the sounds of people passing by, still cannot hide the silence in the air. A couple, Lara and David, are walking on the deserted street. They are young people, just recently in love, with sweet moments and untold stories. That night, the air was cool and gentle. Their laughter echoed in the quiet space. They walked through a deserted side street, where the weak street lights were not enough to illuminate every corner. Suddenly, Lara stopped, her eyes lit up when she discovered a bill lying on the sidewalk, near an old abandoned wall. Lara bent down to pick up the bill, handing it to David. "Look, a bill. Do you think it's real money?" she asked with a smile, holding the bill up to the light. David stared at the bill, frowning slightly. "This isn't real money," he said, his voice a little strange. "This is a hell dollar bill," Lara giggled, joking back. "What are you doing? It's real money. Why did you throw it away?" She held the bill tightly in her hand, looking at him with a puzzled look. David said nothing more. A strange, inexplicable feeling continued to invade him. He couldn't figure out why the money had such a strange feeling. However, he didn't care much anymore and turned away. Lara hurriedly ran after it, not wanting to let the money go, letting the wind blow it away. "Let me talk. You take it. It's real money," she said, smiling brightly. She grabbed the money in her hand and said, "Look, I told you it was real money. The hellish money with its faded color and strange characters, seemed to be embedded in a dark cloud. But Lara didn't pay attention to it. She just thought that this was David's weird joke. At this moment, a truck rushed over. The car passed by as fast as the wind. David's sudden feeling was alert, but he still couldn't do anything. The truck crashed into Lara without stopping. In a moment of fear, the car ran over her. Blood gushed out, turning the road into a pool of bright red. The bill in her hand did not fall. It was still there. In Lara's cold hand, stained red with blood, David stood there, stunned, unable to believe what had just happened. Everything had happened so fast, so cruelly. A second ago, Lara was still standing next to him, cheerful and full of life. But now, she had disappeared into a nightmare that he could not save. While David was still stunned, he saw the hellish bill lying right in the pool of blood, as if it was laughing at their fate. He bent down to pick it up, but as soon as his hand touched it, a chill ran through him. It felt cold, heavy, as if someone was watching him from behind. He could not understand how a bill could bring such horror. Lara was dead, and the bill was still there. David returned home in a daze, still unable to believe what had happened. He tried to deny it, but deep down, he knew something was wrong. That note, that hellish dollar, could be part of the end that Lara did not deserve. He sat on the bed, the note still in his hand. It was an inescapable reminder, a dangerous mystery. Every time he looked at the note, the letters on it seemed to jumble in his mind. The blurry images of Lara lying on the pavement, the bright red surrounding her, indelible. A feeling of dread surrounded him, like an invisible force, pulling him toward an inevitable death. He put the note down on the table, staring at it. After a while, he heard a strange noise, a small sound, like a gasp. David turned around, but saw nothing. He thought he was seeing things, but when he looked at the bill again, something strange happened. The bill began to move. The cold feeling came again, and immediately, David heard footsteps echoing in the dark room. No one was there, but the sound was unmistakable. The footsteps were getting closer and closer, as if someone was coming from behind him. David turned around, but he saw no one. But his eyes met the shadow lingering in the dark corner of the room. It was not the shadow of a person, but an indistinct, blurry, unidentifiable shape. A voice echoed in the space, faintly like a whisper from somewhere far away. It's too late. David didn't know what he did wrong, but every night he heard footsteps in the empty house. Last night, his dream was repeated. The scene of Lara standing on the corner, still clutching the money. But this time, she looked at him, her eyes no longer warm as before, but dark, lifeless. "You can't save me," Lara whispered. David woke up, cold sweat on his forehead. He tried to shake off the images, but the dreams became more and more haunting, as if the hellish money had bound her soul to an eternal nightmare. That feeling came again. The gasp, the strange footsteps in the room. David turned around, eyes wide, unable to believe it. In the corner of the room, the money had disappeared. David sat in his room, which seemed to be getting smaller and smaller. An inexplicable feeling of suffocation surrounded him. Every night, he found himself lost in endless nightmares, where Lara was still standing on the corner with the hellish money in her hand. But this time, her eyes were no longer looking at him with the same sweetness as before. Instead, they were pitch black eyes, like an endless, bottomless abyss. David could not sleep. The noises in the room, the footsteps of unknown origin, continued to haunt him. He tried to ignore them, but he could not. Every time he tried to close his eyes, the creepy images appeared in his mind. From those moments on, the appearance of the money haunted him, and he began to feel as if he himself was bound to something dark and inescapable. Day after day, David could not find an explanation for the strange things that were happening to him. From the ghost dollar to the bizarre nightmares, everything seemed to be leading him to an inevitable end. He researched the money, but it only made him more confused. Stories about ghost money, money that carried the souls of the dead, had appeared in legends since ancient times. But they were still just stories with unclear truth. One night, while sitting pensively by the window, looking out, David saw a shadowy figure passing by the door. A cold wind blew into the room, making him shiver. It felt like someone was standing right behind him. But when he turned around, there was nothing but cold air. He suddenly remembered what an old friend who used to research supernatural phenomena had said about something called the connection between the living and the dead. That explanation had sounded silly at first, but now, with what had happened, he couldn't help but doubt it. And then, that night, as David was getting ready for bed, he felt something different. A strange feeling swept over him. Soft whispers in his ears, though no one said anything. He got up, walked to the window, and looked out, where the dim streetlights illuminated a deserted street. Everything was quiet, but David felt an inexplicable presence, as if something was standing near him, waiting. Suddenly he heard footsteps, a very light one, as if someone was walking on soft ground. David turned around, his eyes tense. The footsteps got closer and closer, and then a faint shadow appeared right in front of the window. A tall shadow, shapeless, only its red eyes glowed in the darkness. David couldn't move. The tense moments dragged on for what seemed like an eternity. Those red eyes, as if they were looking into his mind, made him feel a chill. The shadow drew closer, until it was only a foot away. A mouth opened wide, and from within it, a cold voice spoke. "You cannot escape your fate." David screamed, but there was no sound. Everything became blurry, as if he was sinking into a nightmare from which he could not wake up. When he opened his eyes again, the shadow was gone, but the hellish dollar bill was right in front of him, on the table, as if it had moved there on its own. David felt as if an invisible force was pulling him toward the bill, as if he had been drawn into a game from which he could not escape. The bill was still there, the strange characters still blurred on the surface. But this time, the difference was that the characters seemed to change, to curve, and then slowly, a face appeared. It was Lara's face, but it was no longer the face of the girl he loved. It was twisted, full of guilt, and the eyes were still looking at him, but not with tenderness, but with anger. Lara whispered, her voice full of hatred, "You left me." David could not bear the sight of this. The bill, like a curse, not only drove Lara away from him, but also dragged a part of her soul into it. He stepped back, his hands shaking, but the bill continued to appear in all his nightmares. Suddenly, a noise from outside the room woke him. A gentle knock on the door, then a sound from behind the door. A cold feeling filled the air, as if someone was standing behind the door. waiting. He did not dare to open the door. But then the knock sounded again. And this time, it was not a normal knock, but a squeak like someone was trying to say something. "Don't open the door," the voice said, but its voice was not human. It was cold, emotionless, like a spirit trying to warn him. David stood still, his heart pounding. The space felt more suffocating than ever. This time, he clearly felt something haunting him from outside, an undeniable fear, as if someone was waiting for him to pull him into another world. We can never escape our predetermined fate. And it seems that David's fate, as well as Lara's, is woven into this hellish coin, forever inseparable. David was no longer himself. Everything around him, from this small room to the strange streets he had once walked, had become blurry, as if space was collapsing, dragging everything into an endless abyss. From the hellish dollar bill, he could no longer find himself. The long nights when he sat alone in the dark, there were only whispers from the haunting darkness. And every time he looked at the bill, Lara's eyes appeared full of hatred, as if she was no longer the person he loved. Every time he looked at it, the bill seemed to change. The strange, blurry characters suddenly appeared sharp. Each line of words twisted, as if mocking his fate. David knew clearly that he was stuck in an inescapable loop. Every time he tried to throw the bill away, it returned like a spirit dragging him into the darkness. One late afternoon, when the last light had faded, David decided to go outside. He didn't want to be in this room anymore. He wanted to run away from the ghosts of the past, but no matter what, he couldn't escape that feeling. It felt like something was always following him, never letting go. He stepped outside, hoping to find some peace. But everywhere he went, he felt the presence of something inexplicable. David wandered the empty streets, the streets of Los Angeles, with their dim street lights and fresh air, no longer felt familiar to him. He stopped in front of an old coffee shop. The glass doors were frosted. The light inside was dim, as if inviting him in. But when he stepped inside, the space inside the shop had a strange feeling, as if it didn't belong to this world. The employee stood behind the counter, looking at him with strange eyes. But it wasn't the eyes of a normal person, but the eyes of a spirit trying to convey something. She said, her voice steady like a warning, "You can't escape." Then she turned away without saying another word. David turned around, wanting to leave the shop immediately. But suddenly, he felt a cold hand on his shoulder. He turned around, but saw no one, only a cold wind blowing past. The whispers echoed in the air again. "The hell money has chosen you, there's no escape." A feeling of fear and anxiety spread through his body. Every step he took was heavy, as if an invisible force was pulling him away. He ran out of the shop, not daring to look back. But when he stepped outside, the sky suddenly darkened, as if it was swallowing the light. Beneath his feet, the hell money appeared again. This time, it wasn't lying on the ground like usual, but was floating in midair, an inescapable reminder. David stood still, not daring to touch it. He sensed the presence of something terrible approaching. Suddenly he heard footsteps. Not human footsteps, but the footsteps of something. Not human. Those footsteps echoed in the darkness, each step carrying the heaviness of death. David turned around, his eyes wide, and then from the darkness a figure appeared. It was a man, but no ordinary man. His shape was faint, as if he were a spirit not quite of this world. His eyes were red, like flames burning in the darkness. A monstrous smile appeared on his face, devoid of any life. "You cannot escape your fate," his voice rang out, cold and defiant. David wanted to run, but his legs wouldn't listen. An invisible force held him back, making him unable to move. He stepped closer, step by step, until he was only one step away from David. "You let her go, but I'm next," he said, smirking. In that moment, David understood everything. The hell note wasn't just some strange coin. It was a lock, locking him into an endless cycle of death. Each person who touched it paid a part of their soul. Lara had died because of it, and now it was his turn. He couldn't escape this curse. The footsteps echoed again, getting closer and closer. David looked into his red eyes, feeling a terrible, inescapable fear. But now, something inside him burned in inexplicable fire, stronger than any fear. He had to do something. He couldn't just stand there and wait for death. With all his remaining strength, David rushed towards the figure, trying to push it away. But when his hand touched the body, it wasn't human. It was a dark mass, without a clear shape, only cold and endless. A feeling of disgust filled him. The man just smiled, his eyes burning like a burning fire. "You can't change anything." The sky gradually darkened, and then darkness covered everything, plunging David into a nightmare. No way out. Story 3. Catching a night bus. The American countryside, late at night, always has a strange silence. The red brick houses are quietly scattered. No one knows that in the darkness, secrets are still lurking. There is no laughter, no noisy conversations, only silence and the wind blowing through the tall trees. I stood alone on the small road, the dim yellow light of the street lamps illuminating the road. It felt empty and cold, as if there was something wrong with this night. I looked around. There was no one, only thick darkness. My house was quite far away, and there were no vehicles passing by at this hour. I didn't want to walk through the deserted road, so I decided to take a taxi. My eyes were tired after a long day, and I just wanted to get home quickly to rest. But the problem was, this village was not a place where it was easy to find a taxi at night. After waiting for a while, I saw a taxi coming from afar, its headlights flashing in the darkness, and I quickly waved to call. The taxi slowly stopped in front of me, and the driver rolled down his window, his face covered by the darkness, making it impossible to see clearly. The driver asked, "Where are you three going?" My heart suddenly tightened. "Where are you three going?" I asked myself. I looked around, but saw no one else. I was the only one standing on this deserted road. Maybe I heard wrong? But no, the question still echoed in my head, and my heart was pounding. Without thinking further, I quickly opened the car door, climbed in, and quickly closed the door. I hurriedly said to the driver, "Hurry up, drive. I will pay double." The driver did not ask any more questions, just nodded slightly, hurriedly stepped on the gas, and drove away, leaving the deserted road behind. After a while, the noises from outside gradually faded away, leaving only the steady sound of the car engine. At this point, I began to calm down. However, a strange feeling still lingered within me. I couldn't explain the uneasiness. Something seemed wrong, but I couldn't figure out what it was. Looking out the car window, I saw the houses in the village gradually disappear from sight, leaving only the pitch-black darkness. The street lights gradually thinned out, and only the taxi trudged through the night. I wanted to ask the driver about a few things, but felt it was unnecessary. The space in the car became silent, and every time the car passed through the empty streets, I felt like I was lost in another space. Suddenly, I heard the driver say softly, "Where are you going now?" The voice came from the front, but when I looked up, I couldn't see the driver in the rearview mirror. A cold feeling ran down my spine. Did he turn back to look at me? The strange atmosphere in the car made me feel even more nervous. At this moment, I turned back to look at the driver. He didn't look at me, but just silently drove the car. In the darkness, his face was still hidden. I couldn't see clearly. Something heavy swept through the space, like a cold air, making me unable to breathe. The winding roads, the sparse houses gradually disappeared into the darkness. That feeling of unease returned, stronger than ever. I asked again, my voice trembling, What did you say? I don't understand." The driver didn't answer, just continued driving. And the air was as silent as a dead land, devoid of life. I silently prayed that I would get home safely. This feeling of unease was indescribable. Each turn of the wheel seemed to drag me deeper into a hole. And suddenly, I had no idea where I was going. The road became unfamiliar. Not the roads I was familiar with, but a new road, as if it had never appeared in my memory. I looked out the window. The sky had turned dark. There was no light from the stars, no light from the street lamps. The whole space was immersed in a thick darkness, as if it had been swallowed by an endless nothingness. I turned to the driver, intending to ask about this stretch of road, but there was nothing but darkness. He remained silent, not a word, not a reaction. I felt like I was falling into a bottomless hole with no way out. Suddenly, the car rushed over a small bridge. I looked out, and then I saw an image that made my heart stop. By the side of the road, a blurry figure stood silently. A man, but his skin was pale, his eyes were sunken, and his mouth was wide open, as if he was smiling. I couldn't see his face clearly, but strangely enough, I didn't feel fear. Instead, a cold feeling enveloped me, as if I had encountered something inhuman. A feeling of unease welled up. I turned to look at the driver, and when I looked in the rearview mirror, I saw that he was no longer human. At this moment, I panicked, shouting in panic, "Stop the car! Stop the car now!" But he didn't react, and when I looked back, I saw him turn his head 180 degrees, looking straight at me with a twisted smile on his face. His eyes were empty, lifeless, just empty. At this moment, he spoke, his voice soft but cold. "Where are you going now?" The question rang out again. This time I was no longer able to react. I could only look into his eyes, in which there was only endless darkness. And in that moment, I realized that I was no longer on the way home. I had been drawn into another world, where there was no way out, where there was only darkness and the souls that lurked within. The cold wind blew. The taxi glided through the dark night. The feeling of unease still did not leave me. It grew stronger and stronger, like something invisible was pulling me down a bottomless pit. Every time the car passed unfamiliar roads, without a single light, without a single familiar sign, I felt like I was falling into another world. Not my world, but a dark world with no way out. I looked out the window, but beyond the enveloping darkness, I could see nothing. Not a single house, not a single tree. Only the road, endless, like a barren strip of land with no end. My reason gradually disintegrated, and I began to feel like I was no longer in control. I turned to the driver, trying to find an explanation for what was happening, but he remained silent. I could not see his face clearly in the rearview mirror, but I felt the coldness in his eyes. The cold was not winter, but death, as if he were not human, but some otherworldly being. "Please, stop the car," I said, but my voice was no longer as firm as before, but weak, as if the air in the car had sucked all my strength out of me. "Stop the car now. I want to get out." But he did not answer. There was only the steady, quiet sound of the engine, like the beating of a bloodless heart. Step by step, I felt the threat getting closer, like a shadow standing right behind me. But when I turned around, there was nothing. The car rushed over a small bridge, only a dim strip of light shone down. And then I saw a figure standing by the side of the road. A man. The figure was faint, as if it did not belong to this world. I couldn't see his face clearly, but his pale skin, his sunken eyes, and his mouth wide open as if he was smiling, made me unable to move. His gaze seemed to penetrate me, leaving a cold, endless feeling. I didn't feel fear, but a feeling of emptiness. It felt like I didn't belong here anymore, like I was seeing something I wasn't supposed to see. That shadow, although it didn't move, I knew it was still looking at me, watching me. No words could describe the strangeness of the scene. I turned to look at the driver, but his eyes were no longer human eyes. His gaze was empty, as if his eyes were just deep holes, devoid of emotion, devoid of soul. I felt like I was being pulled into a bottomless pit with no way out. When I looked back ahead, the car continued to move forward without stopping, but I could feel the surroundings changing. The space was suffocating. Everything became blurry, as if we were no longer in this world. The roads, the houses, everything disappeared into darkness. We were swallowed up in another world. "Stop the car! Stop the car!" I shouted, but my voice was no longer strong enough. Every sound in the car was muffled, as if we were moving in a sealed box with no way to escape. Suddenly, I heard laughter. A laughter that was not human, but a strange, distorted sound coming from behind. I couldn't understand where the sound came from, but I knew for sure that it wasn't the driver's voice. I turned around again, and this time I saw him turn his head, looking at me directly. His face was no longer the face of a normal person. His eyes were empty, lifeless, just an endless darkness. And then he smiled. It was a twisted, cold smile, as if he were enjoying my fear. "Where are you going now?" he asked, his voice cold, emotionless. I couldn't answer. The question terrified me so much that I couldn't move. I could only look into his eyes, into that empty gaze, as if he were looking into my soul, reading my every thought. Everything around me became blurry. I felt like I no longer existed in this world. Shadows began to surround the car. Each time the car passed, the shadows grew closer. Strange shapes, unclear, but with a strong presence, as if they were approaching, and there was nothing I could do to avoid them. The cold wind blew into the car, making me shiver. My skin was cold, as if I were in a tomb, with no life, no salvation. The car kept moving, but I had no idea where I was going. The driver remained silent, not saying a word. This inescapable feeling was taking over my mind, as if I had been pulled into another world with no way out, only darkness and restless souls. "Where are you going now?" he asked again. This time his tone was no longer a question, but a statement, as if he had known the answer all along. I couldn't answer because I didn't know where I was going. But one thing was certain. I was no longer a person of this world. I had been drawn into the darkness, and I couldn't turn back. Story 4. Children's Story. Sacramento, the capital of California, is a bustling city but has quiet, peaceful neighborhoods. My son Luke and I live in a small house in a suburban area where everything is normal, with beautiful mornings and quiet evenings. Luke is almost a year old, and he's still learning to talk. His sounds have gradually become my joy, making me feel like I'm witnessing a miracle every day. Luke loved to point at things in the house, calling them by their names. One day, while we were looking at a picture book, he pointed to a picture of a dog and said dog. I looked back and smiled, because he had correctly named the object in the book. This made me feel proud of my child's development. One fine morning, Luke and I were playing in the living room, and I thought everything was as normal as any other day. But that peace was quickly broken by a strange event that I could not explain. As I sat down on the chair, he stopped playing. His eyes lit up, and he turned his head to look behind me. "People," Luke said, his voice clear and sure. I turned around, looking round the room, but saw nothing but the dimness of the living room. No one was there. I felt a little confused, but thought that he was just playing, or maybe he was just imagining things. Still, a strange feeling rose within me, a feeling I couldn't explain. "There's no one, honey," I tried to reassure Luke, but the coldness in my heart wouldn't go away. The next day, I decided to pay more attention to Luke's actions. I didn't want to be paranoid, but yesterday's incident made me think again. We continued to live our lives as usual, but I always felt like someone was watching us from somewhere in this house. Like every day, Luke and I continued to play in the living room. He still laughed, pointed at things around, and called them by name. But while I was preparing lunch, I heard a strange sound coming from the end of the hallway. It was the sound of light footsteps, not belonging to anyone else but us. I stopped and listened, but there was no one. The house was quiet. Only Luke's laughter echoed in the living room. I thought it was just a random sound that I imagined. But then, the footsteps rang out again, this time more clearly, as if someone was moving from the end of the hallway to the living room. I stepped outside, looked around, but saw no one. There was only the dim light from the lamps and the darkness of the house. I returned to the living room, where Luke was sitting and playing. The boy still paid no attention to me. His eyes were only on the off TV, his expression somewhat innocent, but I couldn't help but feel a strange presence in the space. At this moment, I remembered Luke's strange words. People. The boy could be seeing something that I couldn't see. Could it be the supernatural phenomena that I had heard in the rumors before? I couldn't explain this feeling, but a part of me couldn't ignore it. A few days later, the strange things continued. One night, as I lay in bed, I heard a faint whispering, as if someone was talking to me in the dark. A cold feeling came over me. I tried to ignore it, but the whispering continued, and then I realized something strange. It was coming from inside our room. I jumped up, looked around, but saw nothing. Luke was still sleeping soundly in his crib. but I could feel a change in the air. I couldn't explain the cold feeling, as if there was a dark shadow lurking in the room. I stood up and walked to the window, but apart from the dim lights of the neighborhood in the distance, there was nothing special. The feeling gradually pushed me into a tense situation, unable to escape. Suddenly, I felt someone standing right behind me. My heart pounded. I turned around immediately, but only saw Luke still sleeping soundly, no one else in the room. I shook my head, telling myself that maybe I was just too stressed out by what had just happened. But deep down, I knew something was wrong. And when I turned back to look at the faint light from outside, I saw a dark shadow pass by the window. I couldn't see what it was, but I was sure it wasn't what I wanted to see. A week later, I couldn't stand the tension anymore. Strange events kept happening, and I felt like I was living in a nightmare with no way out. Late one afternoon, as I sat in the living room, Luke pointed behind me again and said, "You." I turned around, and this time, it wasn't the usual room I saw every day. It was empty, dark, as if some force had erased all traces of time. And when I looked back at Luke, he was no longer laughing. His eyes were lifeless, as if he were looking into another world, a world I couldn't see. The feeling of panic rose again. I couldn't shake the feeling that someone or something was watching us. These shadows weren't ordinary shadows that I could chase away. They were slowly consuming everything, and I didn't know if Luke and I could escape them. One evening, when the lights in the house were off, I heard a knock on the door. Soft but steady. Not the knock of a relative or a friend, but a strange knock, as if someone was standing outside the door, waiting. I stood up, my heart pounding. When I opened the door, there was no one standing there. There was only darkness, no sound, no trace. But when I looked inside, I saw something unusual. In the darkness, there was a figure standing silently in the room. The face was unclear, but I could feel its eyes, as if looking at me. And then, when I turned to look at Luke, the boy was no longer there. The door closed with a creak that echoed in the space, and I realized that I could not escape this strange presence. What I was facing was not a nightmare, but the truth. A truth that I could not face. Now I knew that Luke and I were no longer safe. That shadow, the thing the boy called the man, had come to get us, and I couldn't run away. The bedroom door slowly closed, its creaking sound like a heavy chain being pulled into the past. I stood there, staring into the darkness before me. The darkness in the house seemed to be swallowing everything, from the walls to the small furniture to myself. A feeling of unease crept into my mind, making it hard to breathe. I turned to look at Luke, but he was no longer there. As I left the room, a cold feeling surrounded me. This house, which had been a place where I had found safety, had now become a place filled with strange things that I could not explain. Everything, from the beginning, seemed to have gone wrong. I found myself standing in the hallway, facing a door. It was a door I did not remember seeing before. It was different from the doors in this house, not only because of its age, but also because of the mystery it brought. This door didn't seem to belong to this house. I knew clearly that there had never been a door here before. I approached, but the closer I got, the stronger the strange feeling became. A sudden cold wind blew past, making me shiver. I put my hand on the doorknob, but stopped immediately. My hands were shaking. I couldn't open this door because I knew that behind it would be something I couldn't face. I turned around, hurriedly walking towards the living room. But the space inside the house was no longer the same. A heavy, haunting feeling covered everything. From somewhere in the darkness, I heard Luke calling. But when I turned back to look, the boy had disappeared. That night, I couldn't sleep. The feeling of anxiety and fear still haunted me, making me unable to rest for a moment. Every time I closed my eyes, strange images appeared in my mind. Dark shadows with unclear shapes, whispers that I couldn't hear clearly, and especially the feeling of a presence that didn't belong to this world. I couldn't explain it, but it kept clinging to me, invading little by little. As I sat on the bed, trying to calm down, I suddenly realized that the darkness in the room seemed to be thicker. An eerie silence enveloped everything. Suddenly, I heard Luke calling my name. You. His voice was soft, as if coming from somewhere far away, echoing in the quiet space of the room. I quickly jumped up and ran out of the bedroom, but when I got to the living room, I only saw an empty space. Luke wasn't there. I turned around to look around, but everything in the house seemed to have changed. The air had become heavier, as if something was filling the space. A strange sound came from outside the window. A long, shrill sound, as if someone was screaming from afar. My heart was pounding. I didn't dare look outside, but I couldn't help but turn back. I looked up through the window, but saw only black shadows of trees, leaves rustling in the wind, and a pitch-black sky without a single star. But in that darkness, I could feel something. A pair of eyes looking at me from outside. Eyes that weren't human. Suddenly, a loud noise came from behind me. I turned around, but only saw my own reflection in the mirror. That reflection wasn't mine. It looked different, not like me. And the eyes in the mirror. There was something strange. They weren't my eyes. They were someone else's, something I couldn't recognize. I jumped up, ran to the door, and slammed it shut. I stood there, panting, trying to regain my composure. But I couldn't. A voice, soft but powerful, called out from the darkness from behind me. A voice I could never forget. Don't hide. The next morning, I woke up in a daze. My whole body was tired, not because of lack of sleep, but because I felt like I was living in a nightmare that I couldn't wake up from. Luke was awake and playing on the carpet, but I couldn't focus on him. My mind was still haunted by the strange events that had happened during the night. Every step I took in this house was different from before. Small noises, fleeting shadows, all made me feel like someone was watching me. I couldn't stop thinking that there was something in this house, something I couldn't see, but I knew for sure that it was there. When I entered the kitchen, I saw a blurry figure standing by the window. I couldn't see it clearly, but the cold feeling enveloped me. My heart was beating fast again, and I knew that I couldn't take it anymore. I turned and looked at Luke's face, but when I looked into his eyes, I noticed something strange. His eyes were no longer clear, but dark. Someone, Luke said, pointing to a corner of the room. I couldn't see anyone, but I knew that what the boy saw wasn't his imagination. Something was present in the house, and I couldn't hide from it. And so each day passed, strange events followed one another. I no longer dared to sleep alone, and I always felt that someone was nearby. Footsteps in the dark, strange noises that could not be explained, all made it impossible for me to find peace in this house. One night, as I lay in bed, I felt an invisible force pulling me out of my sleep. I got up, walked towards the bedroom door, and again felt something outside the door. Once again, I heard Luke's voice calling. Mom, that call rang out, but not from the boy's room, but from a place far away, from a place I could not see clearly. My heart was pounding, but I knew I could not ignore it anymore. I had to find out what was going on in this house. I stepped out into the hallway, where a shadowy figure stood silently. Not someone I could recognize, but an indistinct shadow. It stood there, and I could feel its presence, a feeling I couldn't shake. As I got closer, the figure slowly emerged, and I realized that it wasn't human. It was a spirit that had been trapped in this house, and it was looking for me, as if I were the next part of its game. From that moment on, I knew I couldn't escape this house. Every day that passed, I felt the presence taking over the house more and more, as if it was consuming everything, including Luke and me. I couldn't protect my son from this thing, and I knew that eventually we would never be at peace again. The presence had found us, and in the darkness of this house I couldn't run. Story 5. The Shadow. Staring through the glass. The small house in the suburbs of Canada always gives me a sense of peace. The 4 old walls and the worn wooden doors, but they're always the place where I find comfort after a long day. I live alone, no family, no friends nearby. People often say that living in this suburb can be a bit boring, but I like it. The feeling of loneliness sometimes makes me feel safe and comfortable. The nights here are usually very quiet, although the surrounding houses are not too far away. The dim lights in the distance always create a sense of isolation, helping me to fall asleep easily. From the living room window, I can see the deserted streets, the trees swaying in the wind, and sometimes the neighbors walking by. One night, while I was sitting on the sofa, reading a book, I suddenly heard a slight noise coming from the window. At first, I didn't think much of it, until I heard the noise repeated, small and steady, like someone was standing outside, pressed against the glass. I got up, went to the window, and looked out, but saw no one. I breathed a sigh of relief, thinking that maybe I had heard wrong. But as soon as I turned around, I heard very light footsteps again, as if someone was lurking just out of sight. There was nothing special except that quiet space. I tried to shake off the thoughts and continue reading, but the feeling of someone watching me from the outside couldn't leave me. I shook my head, telling myself that maybe I was just tired and worried. After all, this place was peaceful. I turned back to my book, but the darkness outside the house seemed to be drawing closer. The following nights, that strange feeling came again, but this time it was stronger. Every night, as I sat near the living room window, the dim light of the street lamps outside made me feel even more lost, as if I was wrapped in a world of only me and the darkness. This time, I didn't hear any noise, but a heavy feeling came over me, as if someone was standing outside the glass door, just silently watching me. One night, I decided to open the door to check, hoping that it was just the wind or some animal passing by. I stepped out into the yard, but saw no one. I looked around. The dim light from the street lamps illuminating an empty yard, with no sign of anyone other than me. Returning to the house, I noticed a faint trace on the glass door. I approached, and my heart suddenly stopped. It was a handprint, clearly printed on the glass surface. The handprint looked like someone had pressed their hand against the glass, leaving a trace of sweat and dirt. But there was nothing else to explain it. I gasped, stepped back, and looked more closely. The space around me suddenly became too quiet, too heavy. Who had left that handprint? How could someone be standing outside the door without me hearing? Or had someone come in without me noticing? A feeling of dread rose in my heart, but I tried to calm myself. There had to be a logical explanation for this, but I couldn't shake the strange feeling about the handprint. I went to the phone and called the police. When they arrived, they checked everywhere, but found no one. They told me to just lock the door more carefully and rest assured. But they didn't see the handprint. No one but me could see it. The next day, I cleaned the glass thoroughly. But when I looked again the next evening, the handprint was there again. This time clearer, as if someone had been closer. Day after day, the strange handprint continued to appear on the glass door. Each night, the handprint seemed to move closer. By the third time, I began to feel unsafe. My eyes could not stop looking at the glass door every night, as if an invisible force was pulling me. The feeling of fear grew stronger. I did not dare to open the door at night anymore. Every time the wind blew, I listened, hoping it was just the wind. But it was not. One night, as I sat in the living room, I heard a noise, small but clear, coming from outside the window. At this moment, I was no longer myself. My reflection in the mirror seemed to have become a different person. I stood up, walked closer to the glass door, and this time, I could see a blurry figure standing outside, looking in. The feeling of horror overwhelmed me. I quickly closed the door, but the shadow did not disappear. It was still standing there, motionless. I couldn't help it. My hands were shaking as I turned around and looked in the glass. But there was nothing but that shadow. A person standing and looking into my house through the glass. This time, I didn't call the police. I just stood there, trying to stay calm and breathe. Who was that person standing outside? And why were they standing there, just looking at me and doing nothing? It felt like a game I couldn't understand. Every night, the figure got closer. I could feel the change in the air every time I stood in front of the glass door. The coldness still enveloped me, nothing but the indifferent gaze of the person outside. One night, I decided to face my fear. I prepared a stick in my hand, intending to open the door to check. As I walked closer to the window, a dark figure appeared again, this time standing right outside the door, its eyes glowing like fire, no longer a blurry figure. But what was even more strange was that in that moment, I realized something. I couldn't move. My hand no longer held the stick. Instead, I felt like I was locked in place, unable to escape. That person's gaze pierced through me, and I knew that it had seen me. It had seen me for a long time. When I looked into its eyes for the last time, I felt like I was being pulled into another world. A dark world where there is no escape, only the constant gaze of that shadow. The next morning, I don't know how long I slept, but it felt like I had been awake all night. Everything was a blur. I went to the window, and this time, what I looked out of was not just a shadow. It was a door. The door, not mine, was open. As I walked closer, I realized that the door led to a room I had never seen in this house. The room was empty, except for an old armchair and a figure sitting there, silently watching me. As I got closer, I realized that there was nothing but dead silence. The person staring through the glass was closer than ever, and I couldn't escape it. The next day, I no longer felt safe in this house. The room was cramped, and the silence that had been familiar to me was now filled with presences that I could not explain. I looked at the open door before me and could not understand it. That door, I had never seen it before. It was like a door that had been left in a hidden corner of the house, and now it suddenly appeared, like something born from the darkness. As I approached, a cold feeling spread throughout my body. I could not help but look at that door, as if it was inviting me to enter. But deep down, I knew that I could not. There was something behind that door, something that I could not see clearly. I stood there for a moment, my eyes unable to leave that door. At that moment, I heard a small noise, as if someone was moving in the room behind the door. The footsteps were light, unclear, as if someone was waiting for me to enter. Although I tried to tell myself not to enter, my feet seemed to have an invisible force pulling me towards it. I pulled the door open, and immediately, a cold feeling attacked me. The room inside was completely dark. There was no light source, only complete silence, as if there was nothing in this room. I entered, and when I reached the middle of the room, a cold wind blew from somewhere, making me shiver. I could feel nothing but emptiness, an invisible space that could not be defined. And then, in the darkness, I saw an old armchair, as if it had been there for decades, a sign of abandonment. Sitting on the chair was a figure, not clearly visible. Only the eyes were glowing, as if the only light in the dark room. As I approached, the figure slowly turned its head, and I saw a pale, lifeless face. The eyes, deep as the abyss, stared at me, full of hatred. "You can't escape it." The voice came from the figure, but it wasn't a person's voice. It was a dry sound, like a whisper from another world, a world I didn't belong to. When the figure spoke, a shiver ran down my spine. I couldn't move, couldn't speak. It felt like I was standing between two worlds, between life and death. I didn't know where I was, but I was certain that this place wasn't my home anymore. This room didn't belong to the real world, and the person sitting in that chair wasn't human either. Another invisible presence was looming over the room, a shadowy, indistinct darkness, as if the shadow of death was creeping around me. The coldness became heavy, and I felt like I was being forced into a corner from which I couldn't escape. "You saw me, and I saw you," the figure said again, this time speaking as if from underground. "You can't hide." The figure stood up, slowly walking towards me. The closer it got, the darker the space around me felt. I could see nothing but those glowing eyes that were sucking up all the light in the room. I couldn't breathe. My body had no strength. My legs felt like they were locked, unable to move. "You will pay for seeing me," the voice continued, soft but powerful. I quickly turned around, rushing out of the room, but couldn't escape. The door I had entered was now locked. I turned back, the eyes of that figure still following me, and the cold feeling in the room grew more and more overwhelming. I could do nothing but stand there, scared, unable to breathe. When I woke up, I didn't know how long I'd been asleep. I opened my eyes and realized that I was lying on the sofa in the living room of my own house. Everything around me was normal. Nothing had changed. However, I felt a big difference. The feeling of anxiety and fear was still intact in my heart. I stood up, went to the window, but this time I didn't dare to look outside. Instead, I turned back to look at the room, but saw something strange. The living room window was wide open. The wind was blowing in. The curtains were swaying slightly, as if someone had just walked past. At this moment, I heard soft footsteps coming from behind. I turned back, my heart clenched. Standing in front of the window, that figure appeared again, looking at me through the gap in the glass. This time, it not only stood there looking at me, but also smiled. An indescribable smile. The feeling of fear filled me again. I couldn't breathe, couldn't move. That shadow, that presence, kept following me, not leaving. I couldn't escape that gaze, couldn't escape this obsession. "You can't escape," the dry voice rang out again. And this time, I clearly felt that it wasn't just that shadow, standing outside the window, but dozens of other shadows lurking, watching me. In the following nights, the haunting shadow never left me. Every night, I woke up in fear, with inexplicable footsteps. It felt like someone was always standing outside the door, staring at me, constantly observing my every move in the house. One night, I decided I couldn't take it anymore. I called the police, told them everything. But when they came, nothing had happened. The house was normal. There was no trace of anything unusual. They just told me to lock the door carefully and rest assured. I knew that, whether the police came or not, the truth would not change. That shadow, the person standing outside the glass door, was no longer just an imagination. It was a part of this house, a part of me. Another night, as I was getting ready for bed, I heard the door open gently. I turned around, and this time I saw it. It wasn't a figure, but a shadow, like a large shadow, a shadow of death standing right by the door, staring at me. I couldn't run away anymore, couldn't do anything but stand still and watch it. It had come, and I knew that I couldn't escape it. Finally, this night would never end. That shadow had come to take me into its world, where there was no escape, where there was only silence and darkness. And I knew I was a part of it. Story 6. The Man in Black in the Mirror. St. Martin's Boarding School is located in a remote suburb of Toronto, surrounded by dense forests and hills that obscure the sky. The school has a long history, with ancient buildings, long hallways, and thick classic walls. I have been a student here for a year, and with each passing day, I'm more accustomed to the large spaces. But at the same time, I feel more and more isolated. One afternoon, when the school was quiet after school, I accidentally discovered a small locked door in a corner of the hallway with few people passing by. Curious, I decided to try to see what was behind that door. The old wooden door had no special signs, but the silence around made me feel like there was a mystery waiting to be discovered. After several attempts to find the key from my classmates and teachers, I was finally able to open the door. Inside was a small dusty room that seemed to have been untouched for a long time. This room was not like the other rooms in the school. It was a dark and cold space, with a large mirror standing still in a corner of the room. The mirror was covered in dust. making everything reflected in it blurry and difficult to see. I walked into the room, looked up at the mirror. Suddenly, a light wind blew by, making me feel cold. My eyes were drawn to the mirror, unable to look away. I don't know why, but a strange feeling, as if something was waiting for me in there, invaded me. Under the dim light of the ceiling lamp, I bent down and wiped the dust off the mirror. When the dust disappeared, the reflection in the mirror was not the empty room I was standing in, but a person dressed in black, standing silently in the space. I was startled, quickly turned around to look around the room, but saw no one. When I looked back into the mirror, the person in there was still standing there, not moving, only bright, cold eyes staring at me. I couldn't breathe, feeling like there was an invisible hand squeezing my chest. Someone was standing in the mirror and looking at me, but did not exist in reality. That night I couldn't sleep. The image of the man in black in the mirror kept haunting me. Even though I tried to forget it, I couldn't. Every time I closed my eyes, I saw that cold gaze, eyes without emotion, without life, and I couldn't escape that feeling. The feeling that something strange was watching me from another world. The next morning, I returned to that room, hoping that I had just dreamed something strange. But when I approached the mirror, I couldn't believe my eyes. The man in the mirror was still there, just like last night, with his shiny black clothes and bright eyes. But this time, when I wiped the dust off the mirror, I noticed that the face in the mirror had changed a little. A very fragile smile appeared on that face, a smile that I couldn't explain. My heart was pounding. I turned around, but the room was still quiet. No one was there. I turned back to look at the mirror, and this time, the person in the mirror was no longer standing still. He moved, took a step closer, and it was as if he were walking towards me. I felt like I was being drawn into something I couldn't control. I didn't dare to step closer, but I couldn't take my eyes off the mirror. I couldn't explain this strange feeling. It felt like the person in the mirror knew me, and it wanted me to do something, but I couldn't understand it. Every night after that, I returned to that room. Each time, I wiped the dust off the mirror and looked in. Each time, the person in the mirror came closer, little by little. His eyes were no longer just blank stares, but they began to pay attention, as if he were looking right through me. One evening, I decided to stand in front of the mirror a little longer. I wanted to find out the truth, to understand why there was a person in the mirror looking at me. But when I looked at my reflection, I could no longer see myself. The person in the mirror, the one in black, had completely replaced me. And this time, the face of the person in the mirror gradually became like my face. My heart was pounding, I couldn't bear it. I quickly turned away, but when I looked at the mirror again, I realized that I could no longer see myself. My face, or rather my reflection in the mirror, had disappeared. There was only one person in black left, standing there, looking at me, eyes unblinking. My steps seemed to have lost their direction. I felt like I was sinking into a quagmire that I couldn't get out of. Everything in the room had turned into a blurry shadow. The person in the mirror moved closer, and I felt like his gaze was gradually replacing mine. Every night, when I stood in front of the mirror, I began to feel a change in myself. Not just the image in the mirror, but myself. My face gradually changed. and I could no longer recognize myself. I began to feel like I was becoming the person in the mirror, as if someone was deceiving me. One night, when I stood in front of the mirror, looking into the eyes of the person in it, I realized something terrifying. The face of the person in the mirror had become completely like me. Not just the face, but the lines of the body, the eyes, even the smile. Fear enveloped me. I could not breathe. My heart was pounding so hard that it felt like it was going to jump out of my chest. I realized that the person in the mirror was not a stranger. It was me. The person in the mirror, the one in black, was my copy, getting closer every day. I wanted to run away, but my legs could not move. I tried to turn away, but I couldn't leave the mirror. It felt like everything around me was being sucked into it, like the mirror was becoming a black hole that was swallowing everything. And I realized that I couldn't escape this mirror. I couldn't escape that person in black. The person in the mirror had replaced me, and now I was just a reflection, a part of that shadow. A week after that night, I couldn't help but feel strange when I looked into the mirror. Every time I walked past the room where the mirror hung, it felt like there was an invisible force pulling me closer, forcing me to look into it, forcing me to face myself in it. It was no longer the mirror I knew before. It became something I couldn't explain, as if it had changed, become a door leading to a dark place, another world. As each day passed, I felt the presence in the mirror more and more clearly. The person in black, the face more and more like mine. The bright eyes were no longer just a reflection. I realized that every night when I slept, the person in the mirror seemed to not only stand there looking at me, but also move. One night, I woke up in the middle of the night and felt that the air in the room was especially stuffy. I couldn't explain it, but there was something in the air that made me feel trapped. I stood up, walked towards the mirror, as if an invisible force was pulling me back. As I looked, I saw a crack running along the surface of the mirror. The crack was long, deep, as if it was a trace of something that had broken reality. I reached out, intending to touch the surface of the mirror, but instead felt a cold sensation, not from the glass surface but from deep within it. My eyes could not leave that crack. A feeling of terror invaded my mind, as if some force was waiting for me to enter, but I could do nothing but stand there, looking at the crack, and saw, from within the mirror, the person in black moving closer. The next day, I didn't dare go near the mirror. I don't know how I became obsessed with it, but I felt like I was living in a nightmare with no way out. No matter how hard I tried to stay away from it, I knew that every night, the shadow in the mirror would come back. It would come closer, and I wouldn't be able to stop looking at it. I couldn't explain why I couldn't stop. Every time I looked in the mirror, I didn't see myself anymore. I saw a person in black, but he wasn't a stranger. He was a part of me. The person in the mirror wasn't just my reflection. He had become me. One evening, as I sat in the living room, I suddenly felt a cold air flow through the room. It wasn't the wind, but an invisible presence, as if something was standing right next to me. I turned to look at the mirror again, and this time, I saw something strange. The light in the room had changed. Everything around me was dark, and the only light came from the mirror. The person in the mirror was no longer just standing there. He stepped out, closer to my space. I felt a connection between us, as if he were entering my reality, and I, a part of him. I couldn't breathe, and I couldn't move. It felt like I was being sucked into the mirror, with no way back. I wanted to run away, but my legs felt like they were locked. The person in the mirror looked at me, eyes bright and powerful. Those eyes were no longer mine. They had become something else, a presence that could not be ignored, could not be driven away. Every night, the person in the mirror got closer and closer. Every night I woke up and looked at the mirror. No matter how hard I tried to avoid it, no matter how hard I tried, I couldn't help it. The person in the mirror, his eyes weren't just staring anymore. They were talking to me. I started to feel strange things, changes in my body and mind. One night, when I woke up in the middle of the night, I found myself standing in front of the mirror. I didn't remember how I got there. When I looked at it, I saw the mirror reflecting me, but my face had changed. It wasn't my face anymore. It was the face of the person in the mirror, with glowing eyes and a crooked smile. I couldn't take my eyes off it. When I raised my hand, the reflection in the mirror followed suit. But my hand wasn't my hand anymore. It seemed heavy, as if something was controlling my body. I was no longer me. I could not recognize myself in the mirror. That face, those eyes, were not mine. And the strangest thing was, I felt the person in the mirror smiling, as if he had achieved his goal. I could not bear it any longer. I quickly turned my back and ran out of the room. But I could not forget that image. The person in the mirror was still looking at me, still waiting for me to return. I knew I couldn't escape the mirror. I couldn't escape the man in black. No matter how far I ran, no matter how far I ran, no matter how far I turned, I would still have to face him. One morning, when I woke up, I realized something undeniable. My face was no longer mine. My eyes, my smile, everything was the same as the man in the mirror. I had become him, and he had become me. I couldn't understand it, but I could no longer escape. I looked into the mirror one last time, and this time I saw myself standing there, looking at me. The man in the mirror was none other than me. I couldn't turn back, couldn't do anything but stand there and watch. Now, I understood that I had not only been deceived by the mirror, I had become a part of it. The mirror was not just a reflection, but a door to another world, where I and the person in the mirror were indistinguishable. And when I looked into the mirror for the last time, I realized that I could not escape. I had become part of that shadow. Day by day, I was no longer myself. The mirror had taken over me, and I could not escape it. Every time I stood before it, I no longer saw myself, but another face, like me, but not me. The feeling was inexplicable, but I knew I was no longer human. One night, I stood before the mirror again, as if I had become accustomed to it. I looked into my eyes, the eyes that were not mine, but the eyes of the man in black in the mirror. And this time, when I looked into his eyes, I no longer felt fear. I felt relief, as if I had found a place where I belonged. But when I looked outside, I saw that the space had become dim, and the room where I had been standing had disappeared. There was nothing but darkness. I could no longer escape. Story 7. The Zero Bus Boston. The city that never sleeps where neon lights and car horns never stop. It is a modern city with a fast pace, where people are always in a hurry, busy. As a senior, I had just finished my shift at a 24-hour coffee shop. Exhausted from a long night of work, I took the last train back to my dorm. But when I got to the station, the train doors had already closed and the last train had left. I stood there, feeling like the world had suddenly slowed down. There was no other train. The last train of the day had passed, and I was left in the dark with tall buildings, flashing streetlights, and people rushing back and forth. I didn't want to call my friends because they had their own work, and now I could only solve my own problem. I stood at the train station, looking around, looking for any means of transport that was still running at this late hour. A moment later, when I was about to turn around and leave, a bus stopped in front of me. I looked at the sign and saw that it was bus number 0, an unfamiliar bus route. Looking at the driver, I noticed that he was not like the other drivers I had met. He seemed to be middle-aged with deep gold eyes. However, he smiled at me, his eyes inviting me to get in the car. "This is a special trip. Do you want to come?" the driver asked, his voice calm. I felt a little strange, but at the moment, I didn't have much choice. "Okay, I'll go." I got in the car, and the door immediately closed behind me. The bus started moving, rolling gently down the deserted street. The dim light from the street lamps shone into the bus, illuminating the tired faces of the passengers. But I couldn't recognize them. They all sat silently. No one spoke. The air in the bus was cold and heavy, as if there was something hidden under that silence. I sat down on one of the seats near the window, looking out. We were driving through familiar streets, but there was something strange. Those streets didn't look like what I remembered. Everything around me suddenly became blurry. The tall buildings, the bustling shops, everything seemed to be changing, as if we were passing through another world. "Next stop," the driver's voice rang out from the bus speaker. I turned around and felt that something was wrong. The driver didn't look at me, but just stared ahead with an emotionless gaze. The bus stopped. I looked out the window and couldn't believe my eyes. We weren't in the city anymore. Outside was a deserted street with no buildings in sight, no streetlights, just large trees and pitch blackness. There was no one there, just darkness. A passenger stood up and got off the bus. The door closed behind him, and the bus continued on its way. I turned to look at the others in the bus, and for the first time, I noticed something strange. They were all silent. No one seemed confused or afraid. They just sat there, quietly, as if they were used to this trip. I felt a sense of unease, but I couldn't do anything but sit still and watch. As the night wore on, the bus continued to pass through deserted streets, through indistinct locations. Every stop was a place I didn't recognize. Deserted houses, mossy streets, no sign of life. After a few stops like this, I began to feel that this was not a normal bus trip. Each stop led to a strange place. As the night deepened, I felt more and more strangeness in the air. The passengers sat silently, but I could sense the tension in them. Something was wrong. Once, when the bus stopped on a foggy street, I decided to look out. The sight made my hair stand on end. The houses outside were not like normal houses. They were all ancient, mossy, with blackened windows and tightly closed doors. A large house stood silently in the middle of the street. But the scariest thing was the dark shadow moving inside. I couldn't see clearly, but I felt like someone was watching me from within that darkness. When I turned back to look inside the bus, a passenger stood up. She walked towards the door and got out of the bus without saying a word. The door closed behind her, and the car continued moving. I sat still, feeling a growing unease in my stomach. There was one truth I couldn't deny. This car was not going anywhere normal. As the bus continued to move, I couldn't help but look at my watch. Time passed so slowly. Each stop became more and more strange. We were no longer in the city. Everything was strange now, vague, as if we were passing through a time portal, leaving this world and entering another. And then, on another night, the bus stopped in front of a dark road with no street lights, no houses, only a large iron gate leading into a dense forest area. The driver didn't say anything, but I could feel the silence and the strangeness in the air. A passenger got up and stepped out. But as he stepped through the door, I saw something I couldn't explain. A figure emerged from the darkness, waiting for that passenger. The light from the bus shone on it, and I could see the figure clearly. A man dressed in black, with glowing red eyes. He stood there, not saying a word, just watching the passenger get out. As the passenger approached, the man in the shadows held out his hand, and the passenger stepped into the darkness without looking back. The door closed, and we drove on, but I couldn't erase the image. I couldn't explain what was happening, but I knew one thing. This bus was not just any bus. Just like that, the bus continued to take me through strange places, roads that did not belong to this world. And then, on a dark night, the bus stopped at a fork. I saw a sign on a small building, but the letters on the sign had faded, leaving only some incomprehensible signs. The driver did not say anything, but I noticed that his eyes looked at me very specifically. This bus finally took me to a place I could never forget. The passengers had left, leaving me alone on the bus. And when I looked out, I realized that there was no way out. I was stuck between this world and another world, unable to turn back, unable to move. I realized that the number 0 bus was not a normal means of transport. It was a portal, taking me to a place no one could know, where life and death were just an eternal cycle of reincarnation. In the end, I knew there was no escape. These buses were not just transportation, but a guide, taking me into a world I could not understand. Every stop, every passenger was part of a journey I could not return from. The 0 bus never ended. That night, when the bus stopped, I felt something change in the air. A strange feeling permeated the bus, and I couldn't understand why. Passengers got off the bus one by one, shadows stepping out into the thick darkness without a word of farewell. Doors opened and then closed softly, as if they didn't want to make any noise. And so the bus continued to roll, taking me through streets I couldn't recognize, a place I couldn't name. The night was still quiet, and everything outside the window was blurry. But this time, I couldn't see the darkness outside. I looked out the window and saw nothing but a thick fog rising from the ground, swallowing everything in sight. It seemed like we were passing through an unreal area, a land where it was impossible to distinguish between this world and the other. I tried to turn around to look at the passengers in the bus, but no one looked back at me. They sat still, not saying a word, their eyes empty and emotionless. seemed no longer human. They were just shadows, figures passing each other in silence. At this moment, I felt like I was completely lost in a space from which I could not escape. I turned back to look at the driver, but he still did not look at me. He sat silently, his eyes unmoving, staring straight ahead. I cannot explain what I felt at that moment, but one thing was certain. I no longer felt like I was part of this world. I felt like I was sinking into something strange and terrifying, with no way out. The bus stopped again, this time at a fork in the road. But instead of a normal street, I saw a completely different area. It was not a crowded street, not the streets I knew. We were standing in a deserted place, with no street lights, only the black tops of trees rising from the ground, as if they had existed for a long time. Shadows hovered in the air, as if they were watching us. I didn't understand what was happening, but I knew that the number 0 bus had taken me to a completely different place, a place that did not belong to this world. The bus had stopped for a longer time than usual. The driver hadn't moved, and all the passengers were silent. I looked around, and for the first time I noticed something unusual about the space. There were no stars in the sky, no light except the dim glow from the bus's headlights. There was nothing but total darkness. The bus door opened and a passenger got off, but when he stepped out of the door, I couldn't see him anymore. A cold wind rushed into the bus, making me shiver. I looked out the window and saw that he was gone. Beyond the door was an indescribable scene, a vast, empty space with no signs of life, only vague black shadows drifting in the air. They didn't move in any direction, just hovered like shapeless objects. A cold feeling enveloped me as I turned to look in the mirror in the bus. Actually, I don't remember when there was a mirror in this bus. But now, when I looked into it, I saw myself in it, but it wasn't me. The image in the mirror was no longer my face. My face was gradually changing, becoming distorted, strange, as if it was changing in a way that I couldn't control. I turned back to look at the driver in panic, and this time, I noticed something strange. He was no longer the person I had met at first. His eyes were empty, lifeless, emotionless. He just looked at me, as if he knew that I had noticed the change. He didn't say anything, just nodded slightly, as if he had been waiting for this for a long time. I couldn't take it anymore. I stood up, walked towards the door, but when I touched the door handle, I felt a force pulling me back. A cold feeling spread throughout my body, as if I was standing between two worlds, unable to escape. The space around me became blurry, as if I was being sucked into an endless black hole. The driver didn't react. He just sat there, his eyes still not moving from the darkness ahead. The other passengers remained seated. No one spoke. No one looked at me. I felt like a puppet, controlled by an invisible force that I couldn't understand. I tried to open the door, but my hands wouldn't move. I couldn't leave this bus. I couldn't escape this space. Everything around me began to change, as if the bus was moving through another portal. The feeling grew stronger, and I knew that I was no longer in this world. I was no longer myself. The bus continued to run in the dark, and I had no idea where I was going. But one thing was certain. I was stuck in a never-ending loop, and I couldn't get out. Every night, the bus continued to run through strange streets, places I could not explain. And every time the bus stopped, I witnessed strange scenes, strange figures that I could not distinguish. The passengers continued to get off without saying goodbye, and I no longer felt like they were human. They were like lost souls, without purpose, with nowhere to go. One night, when the bus stopped again, I looked out the window and saw a terrifying sight. The houses outside were not normal houses, but abandoned, broken buildings without any signs of life. In the sky, there were not a single star, just absolute blackness. I realized that I was not only trapped in this bus, but I was trapped in a world that did not belong to me. I could not go back, could not escape. And when I looked in the mirror in the bus, I realized that I was no longer me. I have become a part of this bus, a part of the lost souls with no way out. And I know that no matter how hard I try, this bus will never end. Story 8. The Curse of the Cat. My family had just moved into an old house in a quiet suburb of Santa Monica. The house had a long history and a classic architectural style, with large windows, a red tile roof, and old walls surrounding it. My parents had always dreamed of owning a house like this, and they finally realized their dream when they bought this house at an affordable price. However, as soon as we moved in, I began to feel a strange feeling that I couldn't explain. It felt like there was something lurking in the shadows of this house, something that didn't belong in this world. It all started one late afternoon when I was cleaning the yard. A black cat suddenly appeared from the darkness, walked towards me and stared at me with its shining eyes. I had never seen this cat before and did not know where it came from. Even so, I could not resist its mysterious beauty. The black cat, with its smooth fur and sparkling eyes, was like a part of the darkness. A strange feeling enveloped me as it sat in front of me, silent, as if waiting for something. My parents also noticed this cat, and after a short conversation, we decided to adopt it. The cat quickly became familiar with my family. It always watched people with cold eyes, but never caused any trouble. However, strange things started to happen after we accepted it into our home. In the following days, I began to feel a change in the atmosphere in the house. Everyone in my family had strange feelings about the cat. Every time it looked at someone, that person would have strange expressions. My mother began to become more anxious and irritable. She was often confused, forgot things she had done, and could not remember recent conversations. The neighbors began to notice this change. They said that my mother was no longer the same, and we began to feel that this house was no longer a peaceful place. Then one night, I woke up to a strange noise coming from inside the house. I left the room and saw the black cat sitting at the end of the hallway, looking straight at me. Its eyes were strangely glowing, and I felt an inexplicable presence. Every time it looked at someone, that person would start to change. That strange feeling made me unable to stop, and I began to doubt the cat. The next day, I decided to find out about the history of this house. I found an old diary in the house's archives. As I read through the pages, I discovered a strange story. Many years ago, a family living in this house died in a mysterious case, and this black cat was said to carry an ancient curse. It was rumored to be a cursed spirit, always seeking revenge on the people living in this house. Every night after that, I couldn't stop watching the cat. It always found a way to stare at someone in the family and make them feel different. It felt like something inexplicable was controlling everyone's actions. My father's attitude began to change. He became colder and quieter, not like the person I used to know. My mother became more and more out of control, forgetful and acting strangely. Things started to get worse when one day I realized that I was also affected. I felt tired and exhausted, unable to control my thoughts. At night, I woke up in the middle of the night. The cat was sitting there, looking at me with dark eyes, as if controlling me from a distance. It wasn't just an animal, but something invisible, controlling the minds of everyone in the house. We decided to seek help from a paranormal expert. He came to the house, and as soon as he saw the cat, he became serious. This cat is not an ordinary animal. It has a cursed soul, a vengeful soul. He told us in a low, worried voice. Somehow, we began to learn about this curse. According to the diary entries, this black cat was the embodiment of a soul that had been killed in the past by the people who lived in the house. This soul was trapped and could not move on, so it came back to take revenge on the next people. Every time the cat looked at someone, the soul inside would take over that person's mind, causing them to gradually become aggressive and lose control. We decided to perform a ritual to free this soul. However, it was not that easy. As soon as we prepared the ritual, the black cat began to change. It became more aggressive, rushing at us, as if it knew we were trying to chase it away. Suddenly, I felt a cold air envelop me, and I saw strange images in the darkness, as if the surrounding souls were protesting. That night, we decided to perform the ritual in this very house. The black cat, as if it knew what we were doing, came closer and stared at us. Its eyes glowed brightly, and I could feel the presence of a vengeful spirit within it. Everything in the house became dark and eerie. Strange figures began to hover around. But as the ritual was performed, the spirit within the cat began to writhe and protest. The cat went crazy, clawing at everything within reach, and the screams from its throat echoed like an echo from hell. Finally, when the ritual was complete, the cat collapsed to the ground. Its body curled up and disappeared into the thick fog. After the cat disappeared, the strange events in the house seemed to stop. Everyone in my family began to recover, and life gradually returned to normal. However, every time I looked in the mirror, I saw the image of the black cat, its eyes glowing, looming in the darkness. I wasn't sure that we had truly freed this spirit. Part of me felt that the cat had left, but its spirit might still be lingering somewhere, waiting for a chance to return. And I knew that the curse of this cat had never really ended. Even though we thought we had ended the curse, things still hadn't returned to normal. Even though the black cat had disappeared, the uneasiness in my heart wouldn't go away. It felt like something wasn't right. Something was still clinging to me, haunting me every night. Sometimes, when I passed by the mirror in the hallway, I felt something touching me, not from outside, but from within myself. Shadows were always appearing in my field of vision. There were times when I felt like someone was standing behind me, just waiting to push me into the darkness. Every night, when I woke up, the air in the room seemed heavy and gloomy. I couldn't take a bath or go out without feeling like something was watching me. Strange sounds, footsteps, light scratching kept me from sleeping. One evening, I walked into the room and saw a dark figure appear in the corner of the room. It wasn't a cat, but those glowing eyes held me captive. As I approached, the shadow didn't move, just stood there, staring at me. I stepped back, my heart pounding, not daring to believe what I had just seen. Although I tried to ignore the strange feelings, the miracle did not happen. The black cat, or the spirit in it, did not just leave like I thought. There was something that could not be easily stopped. When I talked to my mother about the strange feelings, she just listened silently. But I could feel that she was feeling the same thing. One night when I was sleeping, I woke up and saw a thick darkness surrounding the room. I heard a soft, gentle breathing, then the cat purring from somewhere in the room. I quickly turned on the light, but the room was still cold, and nothing had changed. But when I turned back to look in the mirror, I saw the image of the black cat, its eyes glowing red like blood, looking at me from the mirror. It felt like it was waiting for me. My mother also began to realize that something was wrong. She went to a specialist in supernatural phenomena. The man came to the house, and as soon as he saw the cat, he froze, as if he had seen something we could not understand. He said that this cat was not a mere spirit. It was a dark force, trapped in this house for generations, and now taking revenge on everyone who lived here. The next day, we decided to learn about the history of this house and this cat. Through digging up ancient documents in the city library, I discovered a dark story about the house we were living in. Several centuries ago, this house was owned by a noble family. But on a rainy night, this family was massacred by an invisible force. They were cursed for the crimes they committed, and this black cat was the vengeful spirit. We discovered that every time the cat stared at someone, the souls of the people in the old family would take over that person's body. This curse did not stop at the cat. Every person living in this house, if they did not find a way to free their souls, would be caught up in the anger of the past spirits. One night, we tried to perform a ritual to release the spirit, but as soon as we did, the door in the house suddenly slammed shut, and thick darkness filled the house. From the darkness, a voice rang out. We cannot escape it. Images from the past, lost souls, people killed in the house, began to appear in the darkness, making us unable to breathe. The cat, at this time, was no longer just a pet. It was a powerful spirit holding power in this house. One night, when everyone in the family was fast asleep, I felt something was wrong again. I opened my eyes and saw a figure standing in the room. A black cat with glowing red eyes stood in the corner of the room. This time, I no longer saw the cat, but a woman dressed in black, her face pale, her deep eyes staring at me. She approached me, and I could not move, could not speak. She said, "It's time for us to meet again. You're the last part of the curse." I couldn't explain the feeling in my heart. She stepped closer, and I felt an invisible force pulling me into the darkness. At this moment, I realized that it was not only the black cat, but all the cursed souls who wanted to take over my body. The next morning, I decided I couldn't live in this house any longer. I didn't know how many more spirits were waiting, how many curses had yet to be released. I told my family that we had to leave this place immediately. But as we were about to leave, the black cat appeared at the door again, with its eyes glowing, and this time, it wasn't just an animal. It was part of the darkness that was engulfing the house. We had to face the fact that this house was more than just a place to live. It was a place where cursed spirits were kept, and they would never leave us alone. Even if we ran, they would find us. At the last moment, as we walked out of the house, I turned back for the last time, and this time, I saw all the ghosts, the spirits from the past, standing behind the window, staring at us. We couldn't escape this curse. The story doesn't end here. The curse of the cat, the spirit of the dead, will continue to haunt and threaten anyone who dares to enter this house. Story 9. Skeletons in the Darkroom. For us, archaeology students, this trip was more than just a normal survey. The old house, isolated in the deep woods of Minnesota, dates back to the late 19th century and is said to be the site of a series of strange events. From the moment we heard about this house, we felt an irresistible attraction. That is why my group of friends and I decided to come here to research and to discover what has been hidden in the darkness of history. When we arrived at the house, the outside view seemed unremarkable. Just an old house with tightly closed windows, moss-covered walls, and the surrounding space was shrouded in darkness. But there was something that made me feel cold as soon as I entered. The furniture in the house was old and moldy, as if time had stopped here. With the enthusiasm of young students, we quickly began our work. This house was said to have a secret cellar under the floor, where it was rumored that some valuable artifacts were buried by the previous owner. But there was one thing that made me more curious. In all the research documents, no one dared to say clearly about the skeleton that the locals often mentioned. "What will we find here?" Ben, my close friend, asked as we stood together, looking at the hard ground. "If there really is a skeleton here, why has it been hidden for so many years?" At that time, I could only vaguely answer, "There must be a reason." As soon as we started digging the ground, we discovered a thin layer of soil and a small gap, unlike normal gaps. Everything seemed to be intact. There was no sound, no change, only a slight foul smell coming from the gap. We pulled out the stones and soil to widen the entrance. When the giant iron door was finally opened, the group silently looked inside, where there was a hidden room. We had to use flashlights to illuminate the room, and when the light shone into the small room, we were all shocked to discover a human skeleton placed in a rotten wooden coffin. The strange thing was that this skeleton showed no signs of decomposition, despite being here for so many years. The bones were solid and intact, as if they had been buried only yesterday. "No way," Lily, one of our group members, said, her voice shaking. "This skeleton, how is it not decomposed?" We stood looking at each other, and a strange feeling, steaky Shrintatin, began to permeate the room. Our group began to search around, and that's when the strange traces began to appear. Strange drawings on the ground, scratches on the walls, and an unusual stench that lingered around us. We decided not to leave so quickly. The skeleton was indeed a valuable find, but there was something in the air that made me feel uneasy. The strange markings around the skeleton made me feel like we had found more than just an ancient tomb. We were bumping into something we shouldn't have. "We need to be careful," Ben said, as he noticed a very clear scratch mark on a wall opposite the skeleton. "There's something wrong with this skeleton, and I feel like there's some force watching us." We turned back to look at the skeleton, and this time, something made me shiver. The skeleton seemed to have moved a little, or at least in a way I couldn't explain. The bones were no longer in their original positions. A leg bone, which had been far away from the head, was now close to the skull. I shook my head, telling myself that maybe it was just my feeling. But then, that night, a strange event happened. As we rested in the main room of the house that night, I heard a strange noise coming from under the floor. At first, it was just a soft noise, like the sound of dirt being stirred. But then it got louder, like someone was moving under the ground. I got up, crept out into the hallway, and looked down into the skeleton room. The flashlight was shining in my hand, casting a dim light on the skeleton lying in the coffin. But as I got closer, I saw something unbelievable. The skeleton had changed. One arm had moved from its original position to near the head. There was no explanation for it. I turned around calling Ben and Lily, but when they arrived, everything was back to normal. The skeleton had not changed. There was no trace of anything else. Nothing but eerie silence. The next day, we decided to check everything again. And the more we learn, the more questions we have that cannot be answered. Why did the skeleton not decompose? Who buried it? And why do these traces exist? Is there some force that still lives in this house? The next day, one of us, Ben, decided to go back to the skeleton to look for more clues. He stood there, looking at the skeleton for a long time, then pulled out a book on paranormal research. What we found out from the book was a strange story about this house. A century ago, a family lived here, and one of the sons of the family was said to have died mysteriously. However, when the body was discovered, archaeologists could not explain why the body did not decompose. It was rumored that the son was cursed and became an undead entity. We continued to learn about the story, but the most horrifying thing was when we looked back at the skeleton. At this time, they were no longer in their original position. The bones had changed position. The skeleton seemed to have moved freely in the coffin. Lily and Ben were both terrified, and we did not dare to stay any longer. The feeling that there was some force watching us seemed to be getting stronger. As the night came, a cold wind blew through, carrying whispers and blurry images. The skeleton continued to change, showing no signs of stopping. That night, as we were preparing to leave, a sudden gust of wind blew in. All the windows slammed shut, and we couldn't open them. The whole house seemed to be covered in a thick darkness. When I turned to look at the skeleton one last time, I couldn't believe my eyes. The skeleton had completely changed. Its arms, legs, and head all moved and formed a strange shape. A blurry shadow began to appear, and from the darkness, a voice rang out. "You can't escape." The shadow began to move away from the skeleton, approaching us. We had no choice but to run away, but when we ran outside, we realized that we were trapped in a vicious circle, unable to escape. As we left the house, a strange feeling remained. The skeletons and strange traces did not disappear. This house had left its mark on our minds. Were we truly freed from the curse? Or was it just part of a game they could not understand? Ever since we left that house, my friends and I have been haunted by strange things. Even though we tried to move on with our lives, there were things that we couldn't explain. The strange feeling always followed us, like a ghost that couldn't leave. Lily was the first to experience strange events after leaving. One night, she called me in a panic, saying that she saw the skeleton in the dark room appear in her room again. The skeleton's eyes, glowing like red lights, were staring at her. She said that every time she tried to sleep, the skeleton's eyes appeared in her dreams, and every night, the skeleton moved a little more. Do you believe it? It's getting closer, a little more every night. You can't understand this feeling, Lily said into the phone. Her voice choked up. Ben and I couldn't stand still. We decided to go back to that house, even though we were all scared inside. But we couldn't run away from it, because something inside us was still unfinished. We left without resolving anything. When we returned to the house, the atmosphere was the same as when we first came here. Cold, gloomy, filled with an eerie silence. Not a sound, not a change. However, there was one distinct difference. The door to the house was no longer locked, as if someone had opened the door to welcome us back. Although we did not want to face the truth, we could do nothing but enter. The atmosphere inside the house became more oppressive than ever. The rotten walls, the broken windows, all gave off an eerie feeling, as if we were entering another world with no way out. We walked through the hallway towards the room containing the skeleton. Everything was silent, no trace of change. But as we approached, something strange happened. The room where we had found the skeleton was now empty. The skeleton was no longer there. We breathed a sigh of relief, but the strange feeling did not go away. At this point, Ben began to search around the room. An indescribable feeling enveloped him, and then he saw something behind a wall. Look, what is this? Ben pointed to the wall, where there was a small crack. He began to dig, and as soon as the wall was broken, we saw an old wooden door hidden deep inside. This door was not like normal doors. It was decorated with strange characters and ghostly drawings, as if it was keeping some secret. We stared at the door in amazement. As we approached, I felt a strange presence, as if some force was watching us. The heavy feeling made it hard for me to breathe. Finally, after some hesitation, we decided to open the door. As soon as the door swung open, a gloomy and cold space rushed in. We entered and discovered a small dark room, only dimly lit by old candles. On the ground, a strange object lay in a wooden chest. It was a large book bound in leather and tied with ropes. Ben gently opened the book, and ancient curses began to appear on each page. The book contained terrifying information. It recorded strange events about the family that lived in this house centuries ago. They created rituals to keep their souls alive, no matter the cost. But in the process of performing the ritual, they accidentally invited an evil force. And now, their souls are trapped in the skeleton. And everyone living in this house will have to pay for their sins. As we continued reading the book, the strange characters gradually revealed a terrible truth. The skeleton was not that of an ordinary person, but that of a cursed soul. The people living in this house could not die. They would be trapped forever in a world between life and death, and that skeleton was the key to freeing their souls. We did not realize that we were gradually being drawn into a terrible curse. Every night, the skeleton changed position as if it was trying to be reborn, to return to this world. And while we were reading the curses in the book, we realized that we could not stop. The soul of the man in the skeleton began to awaken. The faint breathing, the the tiny movements of the skeleton, all proved that something terrible was happening. Everything began to change around us, and there was an inevitable thing. We decided to stop before it was too late. That night, we prepared an ancient ritual to release the spirit trapped in the skeleton. We placed candles around the room, recited spells from the ancient book, hoping to stop the dark force from returning. But as the ritual began, the skeleton suddenly moved. A cold wave filled the room, and I felt the presence of something terrible. The spirit of the man in the skeleton, or perhaps something worse, had awakened and was preparing to find a way out. And then, at the last moment, everything around us went dark. A chuckle came from the darkness, as if an invisible entity was toying with us. The door to the room suddenly slammed shut, and we realized that we could no longer escape this house. As we tried to escape, the house wouldn't let us. The walls seemed to change. The hallways never ended. Eventually, we realized that we were stuck in a loop with no way out. The skeletons, the spirits, and all the sins of this house would continue to haunt us forever. The story never ends. Story 10. The missing person in the room. When I received the news that I had been accepted to a university in Atlanta, I was filled with joy. It was a new opportunity, a new beginning. I had never been away from home for so long, but like many students, I was excited about the new experiences I would have during my college years. I was assigned to an old dorm on campus, which I was told was one of the oldest buildings. My feelings about the place were a mixture of anxiety and excitement. The dorm seemed to have not changed much over the years. The old walls, the shuttered windows to keep out the bright light, and the long, dimly lit hallways created a somber atmosphere. My room was a single room, but the hallways were always crowded with new students. Each room had its own story, and I soon realized that I would have to accept living in a rather plain, unremarkable space. However, there was one thing that struck me as strange about the place. There was a room at the end of the hallway that no one ever went near. It was locked, and I never saw any students enter it. I asked a few of my dorm mates about it, but they were either silent or evasive. Everyone avoided mentioning the room, as if it didn't exist. One night, as I was walking down the hallway to my room, I heard a strange noise coming from that room. At first I thought I had misheard. But then, there was the noise, the creaking of a wooden door, the sound of someone trying to move something around in the room. Impossible! How could a locked room make noise? I couldn't help but wonder. Curiosity kept me awake. All night long, I kept thinking about that mysterious room. Why was it locked? And who was making those noises at night? Part of me was scared, but the other part couldn't contain my curiosity. I decided to find out. The next morning, I waited at the end of the hallway. I was sure that no one would notice me. Everyone was busy with their studies, and the dormitory was always quiet in the morning. I stealthily approached the room, observing every detail around me. The door was still tightly closed, with no signs of anything unusual. But when I bent down, I noticed something unusual. There was a small scratch on the door, as if it had been opened and closed many times. Unable to resist any longer, I decided to try again at night. I only brought a flashlight and was determined to find out. As darkness fell over the dormitory, I crept out of my room, clutching the spare key I had found from a former student in the building. The room was still silent, not a soul in sight. But I sensed a difference in the atmosphere, as if everything in the building was silent and waiting. As I pushed the door open, a cold wind suddenly blew in, making me shiver. The air in the room was heavy, as if it had been stagnant for a long time. The light from my flashlight was only enough to illuminate a small part of the dim room. This room was not like I had imagined. There was no old or dusty furniture like I had imagined, but only an old bed with a dirty set of pajamas lying on it. Everything in the room looked like it had been abandoned for a long time. There was no trace of anyone having been here. But as I entered, I felt an inexplicable presence. The weak light from the flashlight fell on the bed, and I couldn't help but stare at the dirty pajamas on it. Strangely, I didn't feel scared, but only a sense of unease, as if someone was watching me. I couldn't control my curiosity. As I approached the bed and touched the pajamas, a faint voice, as if from deep underground, rang out from the bed. Finally, someone has come. The words were like a whisper from deep within. I couldn't believe my ears. At first, I thought I had misheard. But then I saw the pajamas move slightly, as if someone was hiding underneath. There was no one else in the room but me, and I began to feel like I couldn't breathe. Everything in the room was silent, and I didn't know what to do. "Who is it?" I muttered, my voice trembling slightly. There was no answer. There was only a cold silence. I turned around, ready to run out of the room. But then, I felt a sudden gust of wind, a cold air that made the hair on the back of my neck stand up. I turned back to look at the bed, and I saw a faint silhouette flash from under the pajamas. "Finally, someone's here," the voice said again, this time clearer than ever. I rushed out of the room, not daring to look back. The next morning, I didn't dare tell anyone what had happened. It all seemed inexplicable, but I couldn't let it go. I had to find out more. I decided to talk to a few students in the dormitory about the room and the strange voice I had heard. But when I mentioned it, they all fell silent, as if they were used to these things. "There are some things that are better left unsaid," one of them said, his voice low and heavy. That room is not a place for curiosity. I couldn't stop. I began to investigate the room and the people who had lived in it. One day, I found an old newspaper article in the school library talking about a student who had gone missing in this very room, and no one knew what had happened to him. The whole school rumored that he had mysteriously disappeared after exploring the room. I didn't know what to do when all the explanations came to a dead end. The feeling of fear had enveloped me, and I couldn't leave this place. Every time I approached the room, it felt like an invisible force was holding me back. One night, when I returned to the room again, I no longer felt fear. I was prepared to face the truth. But when the door opened slightly this time, it was not just a whisper. The door swung open, and I found myself standing face to face with a blurry figure in the dark room. That figure was no longer a person, but a strange, undulating creature, and I knew that I could not escape. The voice rang out again. "Finally, someone has come." When the door swung open, I stood still for a moment, unable to believe what I was seeing. The room was the same as before, with only an old bed and dirty pajamas. But this time, I didn't feel as cold as before. A strange feeling came over me, as if someone was near me, right in this space. I swallowed, feeling a lump in my throat. Surely I was imagining things. I stepped into the room. The bed was still there, and the clothes were still draped over it, as if they had been left there for a long time. But as I got closer, I sensed a change. The voice, this time clearer and closer, rang right next to my ear. Finally, someone's here. My heart stopped. Cold sweat ran down my spine. I turned around quickly, but there was no one. The room was still empty. I told myself to calm down, but the fur still clung to me, making it difficult for me to breathe comfortably. That voice was not a normal voice. It had a strange tone, weak but penetrating deep into my mind, as if awakening a long-buried memory. I slowly approached the bed, my hand involuntarily touching the dirty clothes. And as I did so, it felt like a strong electric current passed through my hand, making me shiver. The feeling of dread was unstoppable. I couldn't control myself, but a part of me couldn't leave without knowing what was happening in this room. The stories about this room, the missing people, and especially the strange traces I had heard from previous students, all seemed to be rushing through my mind. I began to examine the room more closely. My flashlight shone everywhere, but there was nothing special. The room was simply empty. But then, when I turned to look at the clothes on the bed, I suddenly noticed something strange. The clothes were no longer intact as before. A small tear appeared on the shirt, as if it had been pulled out forcefully. The stains seemed to be different from what I had seen the day before. This time, I couldn't keep calm anymore. A feeling of unease welled up inside me, but I couldn't leave. I felt like someone was watching me, watching my every move. Strange noises began to come from all directions, from the walls, from dark corners that I couldn't see clearly. Suddenly, the bed began to shake, gently but enough for me to feel. A cold wind blew through from somewhere in the room, as if there was an invisible presence here with me. With determination, I took another step closer to the bed. And then, I saw something strange under the bed. An old crumpled piece of paper, as if it had been there for a long time. I bent down to pick it up and looked at it. On the paper, there were hastily scrawled words. "Don't come near the bed. Get out now. Otherwise, you will be like the others." A chill swept over me. "The others?" I muttered under my breath. Who wrote these words? And who left this piece of paper in this room? This time, I couldn't stand still any longer. The piece of paper in my hand wasn't an empty warning. The others it spoke of. I realized that there were students who had gone missing in this very room before. They had entered here and then disappeared without a trace. I had never heard of them clearly, but all of them had never returned after entering this room. I hadn't thought about these things before, but now all those memories suddenly came flooding back, and that faint, vague voice rang out in my head again, like a reminder. Finally, someone has come. My steps were no longer sure. I felt like someone was following me, but when I turned around, I saw only darkness. And then, I noticed something horrifying. The shadow in the mirror had changed. In contrast to the image I was seeing, the shadow in the mirror was no longer me. It moved differently, like a different person was standing in the mirror, and I couldn't take my eyes off it. No, it can't be like that, I told myself. But the truth was, The shadow began to move. It came closer, almost touching me. Its movements became clear and like a shadow, completely separate from my body. And then I heard that voice again, this time clearer than ever. Finally, you've come. As the shadow in the mirror began to move toward me, I ran out of the room in a panic. I turned around, but the room was different. The door I had opened earlier was now firmly closed, unable to open. I tried to push the door, but it didn't work. The room began to close in on me, as if it was squeezing me in. The atmosphere became oppressive. I felt the presence of something strange, an inexplicable force. When I turned around, I could no longer see the bed. I could no longer see the dirty clothes. Everything in the room began to change. Strange images began to appear before my eyes, scenes that I could not explain. Then I realized something terrible. I was not just dealing with a haunted room. I was dealing with the lost souls inside. And now, I was becoming a part of their story. This room is not only a place of dead memories, but also a place where time is reversed. A place where those who have entered here cannot escape. I can no longer escape. My footsteps became heavier, and I felt like I was being pulled into a deep hole. A cold wind suddenly blew in, and I heard the last voice from the empty bed. Finally, you will be a part of us. And when I turned around, I was no longer myself. Story 11. An old town in Minnesota. The first few days I lived in this neighborhood, I didn't think much of it. This quaint neighborhood in a quiet suburb of Minnesota looked like any other neighborhood. The old houses, the streets covered in autumn leaves, and the fresh, quiet air made me feel at peace. But no one told me that this neighborhood had hidden secrets that people only dared to whisper about. Things that made me never feel completely comfortable. One winter evening, as I sat in my house and looked out the window, I saw a boy standing at the end of the alley. He was about 8 or 9 years old, with thick black hair, wearing old worn clothes. He stood there, staring straight into my window, his eyes blank and lifeless. A strange feeling came over me. The boy stood still, not moving a step. I thought I was imagining something strange. But when I turned back to look, the boy was still standing there, not moving. I felt uneasy. That night I couldn't stop thinking about that boy. I didn't know why there was a child standing at the end of the alley so late. Even though the neighborhood was quiet, I had never seen anyone out on the street so late. Questions kept echoing in my head. Who is this boy? Why is he standing there? The next day, I decided to ask a few neighbors about the boy I had seen last night. The people who had lived in this neighborhood had been here for a long time, and I thought they might know something about the strange boy. I walked along the street, stopped in front of a nearby house, and knocked on the door. A middle-aged woman opened the door. She looked at me curiously. "Hello, I'm new to this neighborhood. I have a question," I said. "Oh, hello. What's up?" she replied. I told her about seeing the boy standing at the end of the alley last night and asked her if she knew anything about him. She looked at me, a little surprised, and then slowly replied, "That boy is dead, honey. He died 10 years ago." I was surprised, unable to believe what she had just said. Dead? But why did I see him standing there last night? She sighed, looking at me with heavy eyes. The boy's name was Mateo. He died in a car accident one winter night, 10 years ago. Everyone in the neighborhood knows the story. But every night, he still appears there, standing and looking into the houses, as if he were looking for something or someone. Her words were like a bucket of cold water poured over me. I felt an indescribable fear. The boy was dead. So why did he still appear every night? I felt something was wrong. An indescribable feeling, as if there was an invisible force watching me. As night fell, I couldn't get the thought of little Matteo out of my mind. The neighbor's story kept echoing in my mind. Was he really dead, or was it just a story people made up to explain strange phenomena? That night, I decided not to look out the window, even though I knew I couldn't stop worrying. But a slight noise pulled me out of my concentration. I turned around and saw the boy standing at the end of the alley, just like before, looking straight at my house. My heart was pounding, and I couldn't help but feel scared. His eyes were deep, without light, just a black hole. The feeling was indescribable. Something strange, terrifying. I tried not to look anymore, but his eyes seemed to be glued to me, as if conveying a message I couldn't understand. After a while, he turned, walked toward the dark alley, and disappeared into the darkness. That night, I couldn't sleep. A feeling of unease enveloped me, as if something inexplicable was waiting for me. I didn't dare to think further, but I couldn't stop thinking about the boy's presence. Was Matteo really dead? Or was his spirit still lingering in this neighborhood? A few days later, I continued to ask around the neighborhood, hoping to learn more about the boy and the story everyone was talking about. An older man who lived at the end of the alley finally told me that he had information about Matteo. He was a very gentle boy. He was from a poor family. They lived in a house nearby. One night, when it was snowing heavily, he ran out to get his toys and was hit by a car. No one knew until the next morning. It was heartbreaking, he said. Every night since then, Matteo has appeared at the beginning of the alley, as if he couldn't find his way home. So, he never left? I asked. No. Every night Matteo appears, standing there, looking into the windows of the houses. Everyone knows he's gone, but no one dares to talk about him anymore. People are afraid that he won't find a place to go. His words made me feel like I was being pulled into a ghostly vortex. Maybe the boy was really dead, but his soul couldn't leave, still wandering around this place, searching for something unresolved. One night, I decided not to hide anymore. I had to face my fear. I decided to go outside, to approach the alley where the boy stood. When I stepped outside, the cold air enveloped my body. The night was dark, with no light except for the dim street lamp. At the alley's entrance, I stood opposite where the boy usually stood. Nothing, just an eerie silence. But then, as I turned around, I heard a small noise, a light step, as if someone was approaching. I turned around and saw the boy standing a few steps away from me, his dark eyes like pits staring at me. "Matteo!" I exclaimed, my voice trembling. The boy didn't answer. Instead, he took another step towards me. At this moment, I felt a cold wind coming from the boy, a haunting, heavy feeling, as if there was an invisible presence surrounding me. "Finally, someone has come," the voice said, this time clearer than ever. The boy said nothing more, just stood there, unmoving, as if waiting for me to do something. And then I understood. The boy was not just looking for a way home. He was looking for someone to free his soul, and I was the only one who could help him. I didn't know what to do, but one thing was certain. Little Mateo would not stop until something was done. After that night, I no longer felt as peaceful as before. Every night, I would remember the image of little Mateo standing at the end of the alley. His eyes seemed to penetrate deep into my mind. No matter how hard I tried to deny it, I couldn't stop thinking about him, about the words, "Finally, someone is coming." Every night, I didn't dare look out the window, but whether I did or not, that image still haunted me. I began to notice other strange signs in the neighborhood. The windows in my house, other houses along the street, all had strange lights on at night, even though no one was in them. Light footsteps, as if someone was walking around the neighborhood at night. Strange sounds from abandoned houses. I felt that something was wrong, not just because of the boy, but also because of the mysterious things happening in this neighborhood. The next day, I decided to find out more about Mateo and his family's past. I went to a nearby grocery store where I had met an older woman before. She had been friends with Mateo's family, and I felt like she might know more than I thought. She looked at me with a stern look when I asked about Mateo's family. "Mateo, that name," she sighed. "It's not a name I want to mention." She was silent for a few seconds, then continued. "The boy died in an accident, but that's not the end of the story. His family, they had a dark, sinful past. The boy died, but his soul could not move on. They said that every night, Mateo would come back, standing at the end of the alley, looking for his way home." "But why me?" I asked, unable to contain my curiosity. "Why am I seeing him?" She looked at me quietly, then whispered, "Maybe you're the only one brave enough to face it. Mateo needs help, and you're the one who can help him find peace." I couldn't understand what she said, but her words echoed in my head. Unforgettable. Could I help Mateo? Could I free his soul and unravel the mysteries that surrounded this neighborhood? The next day, I returned to the house where Mateo had lived. The boy's house had been abandoned for years, and no one dared to approach it. I felt a strange feeling as I stood in front of the door. Part of me wanted to go back, but another part of me urged me to go in. When I opened the door, the air inside was cold and stuffy. The light from the flashlight was weak, illuminating the dark space. The walls were yellowed, the old furniture covered in dust. I felt a presence in the air, something invisible watching me. Every step I took in the house made me feel like I was entering something inexplicable. I walked through the living room, where the upholstered chairs were rotten, and headed for the stairs. Each step seemed to push me further into the darkness, as if some force was pulling me toward an inevitable encounter. At the end of the hallway, I stopped in front of a closed door. I wasn't sure if I could open the door, but I knew that if I didn't, I wouldn't be able to find out what had happened to Mateo and these mysteries. The door opened easily, as if it had been waiting for me. When I entered, I found a hidden room. The room was bare, except for an old bed and a dusty wooden table. But strangely, on the table, there was a piece of yellowed paper, which seemed to be a letter. I picked it up and read it, and what I found made me shiver. The letter read, "Mateo was never truly dead. He was left behind to find someone who could free his soul. He needs you, and you're the only one who can help him." A cold wind suddenly blew through the room, sending a chill down my spine. Where did this letter come from? Who wrote it? And why was it left in this house? And why me? With these findings, I couldn't let it go. I had to get to the bottom of things. I continued to investigate Mateo and his family, looking for any clues that might help me understand this strange event. A week later, I found an old book in the school library talking about supernatural phenomena that occurred in this neighborhood. The book contained stories about souls that could not rest in peace, dead people trapped in parallel worlds. I didn't understand everything in the book, but one thing was clear. Mateo's soul could not rest in peace. The boy remained in this place, unable to find his way home. One night, I decided to return to the neighborhood, to the place where Mateo had died. As I stood at the entrance of the alley, I saw the boy's shadow again. This time, he didn't stand still. He walked toward me, his eyes shining with pain and longing. I couldn't refuse him. "Mateo, I'll help you," I said, not knowing what I could do. "I'll help you find your way home." The boy said nothing, just stood there, looking at me, as if waiting for me to do something. And then I realized this might be the last time I'd see Mateo's spirit. He needed me, and I was the only one who could help him escape this pain. On the last night, I returned to Mateo's old house. I carried the words of the ancient book in my hand and the rituals I had found to free the boy's soul. When I entered the room where I first met Mateo, everything in the house became quiet. The air in the room was heavy, as if an invisible force was waiting. I performed the rituals that the book instructed, lit the candles around the bed, and recited prayers in the dark. A cold feeling enveloped me, and I heard strange noises from behind. Suddenly, the light from the candles began to change, flickering strongly. And then, I saw Mateo's figure appear, standing right next to me, his eyes empty but full of longing. The boy's voice rang out, this time no longer weak. "Thank you, finally, I can go." The boy smiled and disappeared into the darkness, leaving me standing there, unsure if what had just happened was really the end. But one thing I knew for sure, Mateo was finally free, and the neighborhood was no longer haunted. I left the house feeling relieved but also regretful. The boy was no longer looking for me, but the memory of Mateo would forever remain with me, an indelible part of my life. After it was all over, the neighborhood returned to peace. I went on with my life, but every night when I walked through the alley, I no longer felt the boy's presence. The neighborhood was no longer haunted, but I knew that meeting Mateo had changed me forever.